Join me as we unlock the stories of the past, turning the pages of history to discover the vibrant lives, struggles, and triumphs that have shaped our world. But tonight, we're diving into one of the more uncomfortable chapters, the brutal winters of medieval times. Picture yourself in a small, isolated village nestled deep in the cold, where the only sounds you hear are the wind howling through the barren trees and the creaking of the frozen ground beneath your feet. The sun barely breaks the horizon, and when it does, it casts a weak, pale light, struggling to penetrate the thick clouds that blanket the sky. It's not a picturesque winter scene where children play in the snow. It's a season of survival, a relentless battle against the cold that will test your endurance like never before. You probably won't survive this, but I'll guide you through it with stories. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. Let's see how cold it is where you are. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. Now let's ease into tonight's journey together. The winters in medieval times were not the romanticized scenes we imagine today where we sip hot cocoa by the fire or bundle up in cozy layers of clothes. No medieval winters were brutal, harsh, and unforgiving. For the people living in these times, winter wasn't just a season. It was a survival challenge that affected every aspect of their lives. The biting cold, the long nights, and the constant struggle for food and warmth made winter a true test of endurance. As the cold set in, everything changed. The landscape transformed into a hostile environment where even the most basic tasks became monumental challenges. And for those who were unprepared, winter could be a death sentence. Imagine waking up to a world where the sun barely rises, where the light of day is weak and fleeting. Depending on where you lived, you might only get a few hours of daylight. The shortness of daylight hours left little time for the work that needed to be done, and without modern conveniences like electricity or central heating, every minute of daylight counted. People had to work quickly, but the cold slowed them down. Frostbite was common, and many didn't make it through the winter unscathed. For most people, the thought of escaping the cold was impossible. Homes were made of stone or wood, often with drafty walls and poor insulation, and even the richest families couldn't afford the luxury of warmth. Fires were a necessity, but they were far from a guaranteed comfort. The struggle to stay warm was constant, and for many it was a battle they couldn't win. Historians still debate the true extent of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling from the 14th to the 19th centuries, and its role in intensifying these winters. But one thing is certain, winters in medieval Europe were harsh. People living in the northern regions had to endure freezing temperatures that would make today's winter seem like a mild breeze. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It crept into your home, your clothes, and your very bones, demanding you find a way to stay warm or face the consequences. When we think of medieval people, we might picture them bundled up in thick, warm clothing. But the truth was that even the best clothing of the time couldn't protect them from the brutal cold. Wool was the material of choice for most, but even wool couldn't stop the cold from seeping in, especially when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. And let's not forget about the lack of shoes or the poorly made boots, which did little to protect people's feet from the frost. They didn't have the luxury of thick, insulated boots we use today, so their toes often suffered frostbite, making even the simplest task of walking a painful ordeal. But the cold wasn't the only enemy. The medieval winters also brought with them the very real threat of hunger and starvation. The season of winter was when the food stores from the harvest began to dwindle. There were no grocery stores where you could simply run to buy food. everything had to be grown, preserved, or hunted. If the harvest had been bad or if food supplies had been spoiled by the early frosts, people were forced to make do with what little they had. For the poor who relied on subsistence farming and had no stockpile of food, the winter months were a time of hunger and desperation. And even for those with more resources, the constant fear of running out of food loomed large. What could have been stored away for the long winter months could easily spoil, freeze, or be eaten by pests. If there wasn't enough to last until spring, people would starve. Many didn't make it through the long months without losing weight, and some didn't make it through at all. Historians argue that the Little Ice Age might have made winters even colder, but it's not the cold alone that defined these brutal winters. It was the isolation that made it so deadly. Roads became impassable due to snow, and travel was nearly impossible. This cut off trade routes, preventing the exchange of food and supplies. Cities and villages that relied on trade for food quickly found themselves without the means to survive. And in these conditions, disease was a constant threat. With people crammed into close quarters to conserve heat, diseases like the plague and smallpox spread rapidly. The harsh winters of medieval Europe weren't just a test of physical endurance, they were a test of survival against nature itself. So as you sit there wrapped up in your blanket, safe and warm, take a moment to think about what it would have been like for people living in medieval times, where even the simplest actions, getting out of bed, getting dressed, or gathering firewood, were fraught with danger. They didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences, and the cold was just one of the many threats they faced. But despite it all, they survived. They endured. They did what they had to do to make it through the season. And in the end, they emerged into spring battered but not broken. Now that you've caught a glimpse of the icy grip that winter had on medieval life, let's dive deeper into the everyday realities that shape these long, harsh seasons. The cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was the dominant force in people's lives. Every decision, from how you dressed to how you stored food, had to account for the relentless chill that threatened to freeze everything. The struggle wasn't only about surviving the cold, it was about enduring it. For months, as we continue, let's focus on the physical hardships, the freezing temperatures that made every moment of outdoor labor a battle, the bitter winds that pierced through homes with the chilling efficiency of a blade. In the medieval world, the cold wasn't just something you put up with. It was a powerful adversary, one that you had to fight every single day. And this wasn't just a personal battle. Communities had to band together to survive, helping each other through the worst of the cold. But even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. Imagine the scene: you're out in the fields, bundled in layers of wool, desperately trying to harvest whatever crops remain from the autumn season. The wind howls, biting at your exposed skin, and the ground beneath your feet is a frozen, unforgiving wasteland. The tools you're using feel heavier, harder to manage in the frigid temperatures. The work that took only a few hours in the summer now stretches long into the day, and the sun, what little of it there is already sinking below the horizon. Every task seems twice as difficult, every chore a monumental effort against nature's power. For those living in rural villages, these hardships were compounded by the isolation that winter brought. Roads became impassable not only from snow, but from the freezing rain that transformed into sheets of ice. Merchants couldn't make their way through the icy landscapes, and as a result, food became a precious commodity. The local markets, which were often bustling with activity during other seasons, were left desolate and abandoned. The supply chains that had sustained communities throughout the year were now cut off. If you didn't have enough stored up, well, you were in trouble. For most, winter meant self-sufficiency, relying on what you had harvested or preserved, which might not always be enough. When you think about medieval winters, you might picture well-built homes with roaring fires inside, but the truth is, even the wealthiest people weren't immune to the cold. Homes during this time were often little more than poorly constructed stone or timber structures with minimal insulation. Even with a fire blazing in the hearth, the warmth never really reached the far corners of the house. Instead, cold drafts snaked in through cracks in the walls and gaps in the roof. The heat from a fire could only do so much, and in the larger homes of the nobility, where heating multiple rooms was impossible, servants and even family members had to endure uncomfortable conditions to stay warm. While the nobility had some advantages, the peasants who made up the majority of the population were often subjected to much harsher conditions. Their homes were small, dark, and poorly ventilated, often crowded with family members and animals for warmth. A single room might house chickens, pigs, and cows all huddled together to try and keep the temperature up. There were no central heating systems, no fireplaces in every room, and no thick rugs to cover the floors. Instead, peasants had to rely on thick woolen blankets, and even those could only do so much to keep the cold at bay. The fire in the hearth was often the only thing standing between them and a freezing night. But with limited wood supplies, that fire often burned low by the morning. Historians still debate whether the Little Ice Age played a significant role in making these winters even worse, but the fact remains that the cooling climate made winters longer, colder, and more unpredictable. This wasn't just about enduring a few cold weeks. It was about surviving months of freezing temperatures with little relief and few resources to help you make it through. And it wasn't just the adults who had to endure. Children too suffered from the cold, their small bodies unable to generate enough heat to ward off the chill. Many died from the cold or diseases brought on by the harsh conditions. With little to no medicine and no understanding of how to stay warm beyond the most basic means, the young and elderly were particularly vulnerable. The cold had its most devastating impact on the food supply. The growing season was short, and in some years crops failed entirely due to the early onset of frost. Harvesting crops in the freezing temperatures was a difficult and painful task, with the ground hard and unforgiving. Without modern machinery, even the most experienced farmer found it nearly impossible to collect what little food was left. Those who couldn't grow their own food had to rely on markets and trade, but with travel becoming nearly impossible during winter, this option was often off the table. For the wealthy, this was an inconvenience, but for the poor, it was a death sentence. A bad harvest or spoiled stores could mean the difference between life and death. But it wasn't just the lack of food that posed a threat, it was how you preserved what you had. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on preserving methods like drying, smoking, salting, and pickling to keep their food for the winter months. The key was to preserve as much as possible during the summer and autumn months, but even that wasn't always enough. If food froze or was improperly stored, it could rot, making it unsafe to eat. With all this in mind, it's easy to see why winter was so brutal in the medieval period. The cold, the lack of food, the isolation, all of these elements combined to create a perfect storm of hardship. But despite the hardships, people still survived. Communities pulled together, neighbors helped neighbors, and even when things were at their worst, they managed to make it through. It wasn't easy, and it often came at great cost, but survival was possible, and somehow life continued on season after season, despite the constant threat of the cold and the endless struggle to stay alive. Now imagine you're not alone in this struggle. The cold, relentless as it is, doesn't care who you are or how strong you are. It takes everyone down to the same freezing level. In these long, brutal winters, communities had to work together more than ever. not only to survive but to keep some semblance of hope alive. For the medieval people, the harshness of the cold wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental and social one too. It could drive entire communities to the brink of despair, but it also fostered bonds built from the necessity of survival. So let's dive into the ways people managed to stay connected and make it through the winter months, from practical solutions to the unexpected ways that the cold brought people together. First, it's important to understand how life in medieval villages operated during the winter. It wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about managing every single resource you had, from firewood to food, and making sure nothing went to waste. Firewood was the currency of the winter months. People spent long hours in the woods gathering enough to keep their fires burning through the nights and days. But this task wasn't easy. The forests were often miles away from the villages, and the harsh winter conditions made the journey even more dangerous. But the need for warmth was dire. Without it, people couldn't cook, couldn't heat their homes, and even worse, couldn't survive the freezing temperatures. In medieval communities, the work was divided up in a way that made each person indispensable. The elderly and children might not be able to gather firewood or food, but they played a crucial role in maintaining the social fabric. The elderly passed on knowledge and stories of survival, while children were often tasked with helping around the house or gathering smaller pieces of wood. But the heart of medieval life during the winter was the work of the adults, who labored to ensure the village didn't freeze in the coming months. It was about teamwork, resourcefulness, and making sure that no one was left out in the cold, literally. Beyond survival, winter also brought with it a sense of isolation. The snow, the ice, and the freezing winds kept people inside for most of the day, with the freezing temperatures making it unsafe to go out for anything other than the most urgent needs. This isolation took a toll on people's mental health. The lack of sunlight, the inability to interact with the outside world, and the constant cold created a perfect storm for depression and despair. For medieval people, depression didn't have the same name it does today, but the symptoms were the same. People became lethargic, withdrawn, and hopeless. The long nights could feel endless, and there were times when the cold and isolation made it feel like nothing would ever change. Historians still debate whether medieval people were more resilient than we give them credit for, or if they were simply forced into an endurance game that left them little choice but to survive. What we do know is that the cold combined with isolation created a perfect breeding ground for seasonal depression, a condition that affects people even today when the days get shorter. Imagine facing the knowledge that you were stuck in this miserable cycle for months, and the only way out was spring if you survived long enough to see it. But despite all the darkness, there was still the warmth of community. Villagers didn't just survive on food and firewood, they survived on each other. Winter wasn't all doom and gloom, even though the cold threatened to freeze the spirit. During these long months, communal activities took on a life of their own. People gathered in the communal hall or the largest house in the village to share stories, play music, and tell tales of the old days. This was how they preserved their sense of identity and passed the time. It was also a way to keep their spirits from being crushed under the weight of isolation. These gatherings weren't just for entertainment, they were an essential part of maintaining social cohesion during such difficult times. People needed the social interaction to prevent themselves from slipping into the depths of despair. Winter festivals played a significant role in these social bonds. Though many people were too poor to afford extravagant celebrations, most communities would come together for at least a modest festival in the dead of winter. These festivals were not just about feasting and dancing, they were about defying the cold and darkness. They were a way of saying, we're still here. We've made it through another year and we're going to survive another winter. This defiance of the cold was in many ways an act of rebellion against nature itself. It was a show of strength, even if it was just a small act of joy amidst an otherwise harsh reality. At the heart of these gatherings was the idea of unity. Whether it was sharing a meal, singing songs, or telling stories, people found strength in numbers. This was true across medieval Europe from the northern regions, where the winters were most brutal, to the southern parts, where the temperatures were milder but still not easy to endure. And it wasn't just about people coming together, it was also about the animals that were kept close to the people during these months. Livestock, which were kept inside to prevent them from freezing, became a source of warmth. And while the poor peasants may have struggled with food, they were often able to rely on the warmth of their animals to help them get through the bitter cold. The smell of animal fur, the heat from their bodies, and the comfort of shared space helped create a sense of community even in the most difficult circumstances. Despite the hardships of medieval winters, the resilience of communities never ceased to amaze. The cold might have been unbearable, but it also brought out the best in people. It forged bonds, created a sense of shared purpose, and built communities that supported each other when they had nothing else. In many ways, these long, dark winters were what made medieval societies so tough. They didn't just survive, they endured. And that endurance, that will to make it through another brutal winter, is what allowed them to carry on. Though many of us today can't fully comprehend the depth of that struggle, it's something that has shaped the way we look at winter survival and human strength. Now let's take a closer look at some of the challenges that arose from the unrelenting cold and how medieval communities faced the daily struggle against nature. One of the most pressing issues during these long winters wasn't just the cold itself. It was the way that the harsh weather turned everyday activities into life or death situations. The ice, the snow, the freezing rain, all of these natural barriers could isolate communities for weeks at a time, leaving people with no choice but to endure. You might be wondering how such isolation even became possible. Well, in medieval times, the road systems were nothing like what we know today. Roads were little more than dirt paths, often poorly maintained, and difficult to navigate, especially during the colder months. A light snowfall might have been enough to block the way, but when a true winter storm hit, it wasn't just a nuisance, it was an impenetrable barrier. For many villages, especially those in the northern reaches of Europe, this meant that once winter set in, there was little chance of outside help arriving. Merchants, travelers, and even soldiers had to wait for the thaw before they could continue their journeys, meaning that food supplies and even news were often delayed for months. The outside world might as well have been 1,000 miles away. In these circumstances, the idea of wintering over wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was the reality. Communities had to be self-sufficient. People grew their own food, raised their own animals, and relied on local resources. You didn't have the luxury of hopping in a car and driving to the store to pick up supplies. If you didn't plan ahead, you would run out of food, firewood, or whatever else you might need to survive. For peasants who lived on the margins, the failure to plan could mean hunger or worse. Historians still argue about the exact impact of these winters on medieval society. Some believe that the cold winters acted as a form of natural selection, weeding out the weak, the ill-prepared, or the unlucky. Others claim that it strengthened the social fabric, making communities more reliant on one another for survival. One thing is certain, though, the cold transformed every aspect of medieval life. It forced people to change their routines, their habits, and even their social structures. It wasn't just about getting through the winter, it was about creating a system of survival that could withstand the trials of nature, The snow and ice didn't just affect people's ability to get from one place to another, they also drastically affected their access to food. If you couldn't grow crops during the colder months, and if you couldn't rely on outside trade, then the food you had stockpiled was everything. For those who had successfully harvested and preserved food, winter meant that they could last. But for others, it was a time of gnawing hunger and desperation. But storing food wasn't as simple as tossing a few sacks of grain into the cellar. In a world without refrigeration, food preservation was a delicate art. Salted meats, dried fruits, pickled vegetables, these were the staples of winter survival. But if the food wasn't stored properly, it could go bad quickly, leading to spoilage or contamination. Let's take a moment to consider the delicate science of food preservation. In a time without refrigeration, people had to rely on methods like drying, salting, pickling, and smoking to make food last through the cold months. Dried meat could last for months, but it had to be carefully cured and kept in cool, dry conditions. Pickled vegetables provided a source of nutrition, and the acid in the brine could help preserve the food. Salt was one of the most important preservation methods, but it was expensive and not always readily available. The medieval economy didn't allow for the luxury of bulk food storage, and the process of preservation itself required an understanding of both temperature and humidity. The cold also took its toll on the livestock that many medieval families relied on for food, milk, eggs, and wool. Animals, much like humans, needed shelter and warmth to survive the winter. Cows, sheep, and pigs were brought into the barns to keep warm during the coldest months, and the barnyard became a shared space of both humans and animals seeking warmth. But even this didn't guarantee survival. The winter months were harsh on young animals, and many didn't survive the freezing temperatures. Even healthy animals could fall victim to the cold, with frostbite and disease threatening the herd. If an animal died or became too weak to produce milk or meat, the entire family might be left without a vital source of sustenance. You might be thinking that surely medieval people had some means of insulating their homes to combat the cold right after all. Wouldn't they have at least understood the importance of shelter? Well, sort of. The reality is that most medieval homes were constructed with the barest minimum of protection against the elements. Many houses were simple structures made from stone or timber with thatched roofs and dirt floors. The walls were often thick enough to provide some shelter, but there was little in the way of insulation. Gaps in the walls, chimneys that didn't draft properly, and poor ceiling meant that the inside of a house was often as cold as the outside. And that wasn't the worst part. The rooms were often cramped with multiple generations living in the same space, including children and livestock. This created the perfect environment for disease to spread quickly. The cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a constant reminder of how fragile life was. Now let's imagine that you're in one of these homes huddling around the fire trying to stay warm. The fire might not be enough to heat the entire room, and with every gust of wind, the temperature seems to drop even further. The cold seeps in through the cracks in the walls, and the smoke from the fire lingers in the air, making it hard to breathe. You're trying to keep warm, but every breath feels like you're inhaling ice. The hearth becomes the center of your world, your one refuge from the cold. But as the fire burns down, you realize there's no more wood to keep it going. You're stuck in a cold house with nothing but the heat from the animals and the people around you to keep you from freezing. It's a constant struggle to stay warm to stay alive. Historians argue that these conditions had a profound impact on the psychology of medieval people. Surviving the cold and the isolation often meant that communities had to form close-knit bonds, but at the same time it contributed to an environment where paranoia and distrust could thrive. With food, firewood, and warmth in such short supply, people often turned inward, relying on their families and neighbors to make it through the season. But as we'll see, even these bonds had their limits. In some cases, the struggle for survival drove people to extreme measures, leading to theft, violence, and betrayal. Survival in the medieval world was about more than just physical strength, it was about mental resilience. Those who could endure the isolation, the hunger, and the cold were the ones who made it through the winter. The rest were left behind forgotten in the cold. As we continue to explore the harsh realities of medieval winters, it's crucial to understand just how much these winters shaped medieval society, not just in terms of survival, but in every facet of life. It wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about dealing with the profound psychological, social, and economic challenges it presented. The bitter chill affected everything from food production and community structures to belief systems and long-term survival strategies. In this section, we'll dive into the social dynamics of medieval winters, how people coped with the mental toll of the season, and the role of religion, superstition, and communal activities in helping them persevere through the endless cold. It's easy to romanticize the medieval world from a modern perspective. We think of knights in shining armor, grand castles, and the ideals of chivalry, but the reality for the majority of medieval people was far less glamorous. Winter, in particular, was a time of suffering, hardship, and sometimes despair. When the cold came, it didn't discriminate. Whether you were a peasant in a tiny village or a noble in a grand manor, everyone had to deal with the bitter chill in one way or another. But perhaps the most profound challenge wasn't just surviving the cold, it was the mental and emotional toll of facing a seemingly endless winter. Historians still debate the extent to which seasonal affective disorder, SAD, or winter depression affected medieval people. We tend to think of these issues as modern concepts, but it's likely that the medieval population experienced their own form of winter blues, even if they didn't have a name for it. Imagine facing months of cold, dark nights with little to do but huddle inside your home. You couldn't just pick up a smartphone or a book to pass the time. You didn't have Netflix or the internet to distract you. Instead, you spent your days in isolation, perhaps helping around the house, caring for animals, or doing whatever labor was necessary to prepare for the next season. For those who didn't have the luxury of a warm fire or food to last, the threat of death from hunger or cold loomed large. Without the modern understanding of mental health, the psychological strain of prolonged winters likely caused increased anxiety, stress, and depression. People felt the cold not just physically but emotionally. The isolation and the lack of sunlight made everything feel darker, heavier. Without the bustling activity of warmer months, the silence and stillness could lead to feelings of hopelessness. And for those already struggling with illness, the cold was a death sentence. The long winter nights with no escape from the cold or darkness must have created a sense of foreboding that lasted for months. Yet, despite this mental toll, people found ways to cope. This is where the power of community and religion played an essential role in getting through the winter. Social bonds became incredibly important during these long, isolating months. For medieval people, the communal hearth became the center of life. It wasn't just a place to cook food or keep warm, it was where people gathered for socialization, storytelling, and support. The warmth of the fire wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It was a shared experience that brought people together. But these gatherings weren't just about surviving the cold, they were about survival itself. In the absence of entertainment or distractions, people relied on each other for emotional support. In many villages, groups of people would meet in the largest home, often the house of the wealthiest person, or the village hall, to share news stories and songs. These meetings were more than just for passing the time. They were a way for people to stay connected and prevent loneliness from taking hold. These gatherings helped people maintain their humanity in a world that often seemed brutal and indifferent. Without them, the isolation would have been unbearable. But it wasn't just the warmth of a fire or the presence of family and neighbors that helped people get through the winter. Religion also played a huge role in the mental and emotional resilience of medieval people. During this time, religion was deeply woven into every aspect of life, and winter, with its hardships, was no exception. People relied on their faith to give them strength in the darkest times. For many, the cold, harsh winter was seen as a trial, a test from God that they needed to endure. This belief provided comfort for some, but for others, it created a sense of dread. What if they weren't prepared enough? What if they hadn't done enough good deeds? Was God punishing them when the cold? These are questions medieval people likely grappled with in their hardest months. Church services became a central part of life during the winter months. These services weren't just spiritual, they were communal gatherings that brought people together, providing a sense of warmth, both literal and metaphorical. The church was often one of the only places that offered shelter from the cold, and it provided an opportunity to gather as a community, to pray for survival, and to find comfort in shared beliefs. The church was a place of hope during a season when hope was often hard to come by. In addition to religion, superstitions and folklore played a significant role in how people coped with the cold. Winter, with its long nights and harsh conditions, was the perfect breeding ground for supernatural beliefs. The darkness of winter made it easier to believe in things that went bump in the night, and many medieval people attributed the harshness of winter to supernatural forces. In some regions, it was believed that the cold was a manifestation of angry spirits, while in others it was seen as a sign of bad luck or divine punishment. The long nights were filled with stories of ghosts, demons, and the undead. These stories, though frightening, provided a sense of control over the uncontrollable, giving people something to talk about and something to focus on besides the cold and isolation. Additionally, many medieval people believed in rituals and charms that could ward off evil spirits or protect them from the harsh winter conditions. These beliefs were often tied to ancient pagan traditions that had been integrated into Christian practices. For example, people would hang herbs over their doors or carve symbols into their doors to keep away evil spirits. Some believed that the act of putting salt in the fire would ward off bad luck, while others placed their trust in amulets and talismans. These rituals were not only about protection, they were a way to cope with the psychological strain of winter. They offered people a sense of agency in a world that often felt completely out of their control. But not all aspects of medieval winters were dark and foreboding. Despite the challenges, people still found ways to celebrate. Winter festivals, though simple by modern standards, were vital for maintaining morale. These festivals often revolved around religious observances like Christmas and provided a much-needed respite from the harshness of the season. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with feasting music and celebrations, and these festivals gave people something to look forward to in the midst of the cold and isolation. These celebrations provided a sense of community, reaffirming bonds that were crucial for survival. They were a way of defying the cold, saying, "We've made it this far and we'll make it through the rest." But even with these celebrations, the cold still dominated the landscape. It was a relentless force that year after year defined the rhythm of medieval life. The winters were long, dark, and difficult, and they exacted a toll on the body, mind, and spirit. Despite the strength of community religion and shared resilience, many didn't survive the winters. The elderly, the sick, and the young were especially vulnerable. It's estimated that many medieval communities lost a significant portion of their population during these cold months. Deaths from malnutrition disease and the cold itself were common, and this seasonal death toll became a fact of life in the Middle Ages. As we reflect on these long winters, it's easy to see how they shaped the medieval worldview. These harsh, cold months didn't just alter the physical landscape, they altered the way people thought about the world. Winter was a time of trial, of survival, and of community. It was a season that more than any other defined the resilience of medieval people. Though they had little in the way of material comforts, they had something far more enduring: the will to survive, to endure, and to find strength in one another. And as we'll see, it was the spirit of endurance that allowed them to face even the worst of what the cold could throw at them. The end of winter in medieval times wasn't necessarily the end of suffering. In fact, spring often brought its own set of challenges and dangers. But before we dive into the complex realities of transitioning from one season to the next, let's first consider how people managed to get through the depths of winter in the first place. We've already discussed the physical hardships, the freezing cold, the isolation, and the psychological toll. But what about the practical strategies that medieval people employed to keep themselves alive during the most brutal months of the year? How did they manage the immense stress and strain that came with surviving such extreme conditions? To start, let's look at one of the most critical resources for any medieval household: food. Food was the cornerstone of survival, and without it, no amount of warmth or shelter would be enough to see people through the winter. The process of managing food supplies during winter was an intricate dance of preparation, preservation, and rationing. In the months leading up to winter, families would engage in frantic activity to harvest, store, and preserve as much food as possible. Crops that grew during the warmer months were carefully harvested and stored in cool, dry places, often in cellars or barns where the temperature remained steady. However, it wasn't enough to simply store food. It had to be preserved for the long winter months when fresh produce and livestock were scarce. In a world without refrigeration or modern preservation techniques, medieval people relied on methods like salting, pickling, drying, and smoking to ensure that their food lasted throughout the season. Salt was a precious commodity during this time, as it was the primary method of preserving meat and fish. People would pack meat into barrels of salt, hoping to keep it from spoiling before it could be consumed. The salting process helped to prevent bacterial growth and preserve the meat for months at a time. But salt wasn't only used for meat, it was also used to preserve vegetables, making pickled items a staple in many households. Meat wasn't the only food people preserved, of course. Dried fruits and grains like wheat, barley, and oats were stored for use in stews, breads, and porridges. These dried foods could last for months, providing necessary calories when fresh food was unavailable. But these preserved foods came with their own set of challenges. Dried fruits, for example, could easily be infested with pests, especially in a time before proper food storage containers. Mice, rats, and insects could quickly ruin entire stores of food, turning what was meant to sustain a family into a rotten, inedible mess. The constant vigilance required to keep food supplies safe from pests added another layer of stress to an already difficult season. While preservation techniques were important, the real key to survival lay in rationing. People in medieval times didn't have the luxury of going to the store whenever they ran out of food. Everything they had was carefully rationed to ensure it would last through the winter. Families kept track of how much food they had left, carefully measuring out portions to avoid running out too soon. For the poor who had no large stockpiles of food to fall back on, this was a matter of life and death. Running out of food before spring arrived meant starvation, and it was a grim reality that many faced. This constant fear of running out of food combined with the cold isolation and the psychological toll of the season made winter the most difficult time of year for medieval people. But food wasn't the only resource that had to be managed carefully. Firewood was another crucial element of survival. Without fire, there was no warmth, no ability to cook food, and no way to survive the freezing temperatures. The importance of firewood cannot be overstated, and the process of gathering it was an essential part of medieval winter survival. People spent hours each day cutting down trees and hauling logs back to their homes. This task was made even more difficult by the cold itself, which made it harder to work and kept people indoors for much of the time. It wasn't just about gathering firewood, it was about conserving it. The amount of firewood required to keep a family warm through the winter was substantial, and once it was gone, there was little to no chance of acquiring more until spring. In a time without modern tools, chopping wood was a labor-intensive and exhausting task. Even wealthy families who could afford larger homes and larger supplies of wood had to carefully ration their firewood to ensure they didn't run out. In addition to firewood, there was the matter of heating. Medieval homes, especially in rural areas, were poorly insulated with thick stone or timber walls and thatched roofs. The homes were often small, with several people and animals huddling together to stay warm. The hearth or central fire was the heart of the home, providing heat and light. But the hearth was not enough to warm the entire house. The heat from the fire radiated only a few feet around it, and the rest of the house remained cold and damp. It wasn't unusual for people to sleep next to the fire or even in the same room as their animals in order to stay warm. This close proximity to the fire, while it provided warmth, also created dangers. The air inside the home became thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Fires, though necessary for survival, also posed a constant risk of spreading and burning down entire homes. Beyond the physical labor of gathering food and firewood, the mental toll of surviving medieval winters was immense. As we've discussed, the isolation, the lack of sunlight, and the constant cold created a perfect storm for mental health issues. People had little to occupy their time during the long winter nights. Without modern forms of entertainment like books, television, or social media, people turned to storytelling, singing, and religious observance to pass the time. But even these activities couldn't fully alleviate the mental strain of living in such harsh conditions. The long nights and cold days had a profound effect on people's psychological well-being. The isolation made everything feel more difficult, and the constant threat of starvation, sickness, and death hung over everyone's head. Children in particular were vulnerable during these months. They were more likely to fall ill from the cold or malnutrition, and the stress of watching family members struggle to survive had a lasting impact on their mental development. Adults too experienced the psychological toll of the season. Seasonal affective disorder (SID) was likely a concern, though medieval people wouldn't have had a name for it. The darkness, the cold, and the constant fight for survival likely led to a form of depression that made everything seem more difficult. The lack of sunlight combined with the isolation made it easy to feel hopeless. One of the ways medieval people coped with the stress of winter was through religious rituals. Religion played a central role in the lives of medieval people, and during the cold winter months, the church provided both spiritual comfort and physical shelter. People turned to prayer and religious observance for strength, hoping that God would provide for them during this difficult time. Church services, which were often held in warmer buildings, provided a sense of community and a break from the isolation of the home. The church became a sanctuary during the harsh winter months, offering both solace and social connection. In addition to formal religious practices, there were many superstitions and folk beliefs tied to the winter months. People believed that the cold was a punishment from God or a sign of bad luck. In some areas, there were rituals designed to ward off the spirits of winter or to ensure that the harvest would be successful in the coming year. These superstitions were deeply embedded in everyday life, and they provided people with the sense of control over an otherwise uncontrollable situation. The rituals gave people a way to push back against the relentless cold, to find meaning in the suffering, and to hold on to the hope that they would survive another winter. While these religious and superstitious practices may have provided some comfort, they also reflected the harsh realities of medieval life. People turned to religion and rituals not just out of faith, but out of necessity. They needed something to cling to during the darkest months of the year. The psychological and emotional toll of winter was overwhelming, and the social support provided by religion, community, and family was the only thing that kept many people going. Without it, the cold would have been even more unbearable. The importance of family and community during the winter months cannot be overstated. Whether it was helping each other gather firewood, share food, or simply provide companionship during the long nights, the bonds of family and friendship were crucial for survival. People relied on their neighbors and extended families to get through the cold months. And while survival was always a struggle, the strength of these bonds was one of the few things that made it possible to endure. As we move on from the cold months and toward the spring, it's important to remember that winter was not just a season, it was a force that shaped every aspect of medieval life. From the practical realities of food preservation and firewood collection, to the psychological toll of isolation and despair, winter defined the experience of living in the Middle Ages. But it also forged resilience, community, and faith in ways that continue to shape the human spirit to this day. As the cold months of winter slowly began to give way to the promise of spring, the world of medieval people began to stir again. Yet for all the relief that spring brought, it did not come without its own challenges. The thawing of the land, the return of sunlight, and the melting of snow were welcome signs that survival had been achieved. But the harsh realities of medieval life did not disappear with the arrival of warmer temperatures. The shift from winter to spring was a delicate transition, a precarious time when the lingering effects of winter could still devastate communities that had not yet fully recovered. In this section, we will explore the challenges and survival strategies of the early spring, focusing on how the lingering trauma of winter shaped the way people approached the new season. When the snow began to melt and the days grew longer, it was easy to imagine that life would immediately return to its vibrant pace. But for many medieval people, the harshness of winter had already taken its toll, and spring was a time of reckoning. The effects of the long winter malnutrition illness and a depletion of resources meant that the first few months of spring were often marked by the struggle to rebuild, to gather what was left of the resources, and to prepare for the growing season ahead. It wasn't a season of celebration, but a time of cautious optimism. The land was thawing, but the winter had left its mark. The arrival of spring brought with it the return of life, but also the return of uncertainty. The harsh winter had caused damage to crops, and some of the stored food would have been ruined by spoilage or infestation. The effects of frost and freezing temperatures on plants could be catastrophic, and even if the weather warmed, the soil remained cold and unwelcoming. For people living in agrarian communities, the recovery process after a long winter was slow and painful. In many cases, the seeds for the next harvest hadn't yet been planted, and food stocks from the winter months had already been depleted. This left many families facing the frightening reality that they might not have enough food to last them until the next harvest. The first weeks of spring were often characterized by the anxiety of waiting to see whether crops would begin to grow, or if the lingering frost would kill off any new shoots. Even as the earth began to thaw, the soil was often too cold for planting, and farmers would need to wait for the right conditions. While it might seem that the worst was over with the end of winter, medieval people knew that spring was just another battleground in the cycle of survival. The uncertainty of the new season was just as intense as the uncertainty of winter. Historians still debate how much agricultural hardship during the spring contributed to the medieval pattern of cycles of abundance and famine. What is clear, however, is that the transition from winter to spring was never a simple process of renewal. After a brutal winter, the land often needed more time to recover, and the chances of a successful harvest were far from guaranteed. Farmers relied on their experience and understanding of the land, but even their best efforts could be thwarted by late frosts, unseasonably wet weather, or pest infestations that would plague the crops before they even had a chance to mature. During these early spring months, medieval people were at their most vulnerable. The food stores they had carefully prepared in the autumn might already be running out and the new harvest hadn't yet arrived. This time of year was fraught with tension as people lived on the remnants of last year's crops, hoping that the new season would bring enough to keep them alive. This vulnerability was felt across social classes, though more acutely among peasants. For them, a poor spring harvest could mean hunger, and even death, especially in regions where resources were scarce. The poorest members of society without access to reserves or surplus were especially at risk. As the first shoots of spring began to appear, medieval people turned their attention to the task of rebuilding and preparing for the growing season ahead. The spring thaw meant that much of the land could finally be worked again. Fields that had been frozen for months could now be tilled, seeds planted, and crops raised. However, the arrival of spring also brought with it the risks of flooding, as the melting snow and heavy rains could quickly turn fields into soggy wastelands, making them impossible to cultivate. Even the act of plowing was fraught with difficulty. The tools, though effective, were often worn and needed maintenance after a harsh winter. The fields, still soaked with melted snow, could become sticky and hard to manage. For many, spring was not just a time to plant, it was a time to mend and rebuild. The damage from the winter, including broken homes, collapsed fences, and ravaged crops, needed to be addressed. Medieval people were no strangers to hardship, but this period of transition forced them to rely on the communal spirit that had helped them survive the winter months. Villagers worked together to repair their homes and to restore the farm tools, wagons, and other equipment necessary for the planting season. It was during this time that the importance of cooperation and mutual support became clear. People relied on each other not just for warmth and food, but for the hard work of recovery and rebuilding. This period of physical labor and recovery was also a time of great hope and anxiety. As people began to work the land again, they carried the weight of last year's hardships with them. They worked the soil with the knowledge that they were not just preparing for a harvest, but for survival. Spring was not just a time of rebirth, it was a time of testing, a time when people began to see whether they would be able to survive another year. Even with the promise of warmer weather, the dangers of famine, disease, and the unpredictable weather of the coming months loomed large. At the same time, spring was also a time of spiritual renewal. After the cold, bleak months of winter, many medieval people turned to their faith to find comfort and strength. Religious observances became an important part of life again as people attended church services and offered prayers for a successful harvest. The arrival of spring was often marked by religious festivals, many of which focused on the themes of rebirth and fertility. These celebrations were a way for communities to come together and give thanks for the return of warmth and light. They were also a way to reaffirm faith in God, trusting that the coming months would bring the resources needed to survive. Despite all of the uncertainty, there was a sense of optimism during the early weeks of spring. People began to believe that with the return of the sun, the cold would finally release its grip. The winter had been a time of survival, but now with the arrival of spring, there was hope that life would be more abundant. The long days and warmer temperatures meant that farming could begin again in earnest and families could look forward to the crops that would come. It wasn't a guarantee, of course, but it was a promise, the promise of a new season that could bring life. However, the harsh reality of medieval life meant that this optimism was often short lived. Even as the thawed earth invited people to plant, the looming threat of hunger and disease persisted. The rising temperatures would often bring with them an increase in the pests that plagued crops, including rats, locusts, and insects that could ruin an entire harvest. Though the soil might be warm enough to plant, the agricultural system was fragile. There was no certainty that the weather would cooperate. Rain drought and late frost could still wreak havoc on crops, leaving people vulnerable once again. Thus, the end of winter did not signify the end of hardship. Spring was a time of transition between survival and the hope of a better future. The challenges faced during the early spring months were a reminder that the struggle for survival was never truly over. Every season came with its own set of obstacles, and people had to adapt and innovate in order to overcome them. As the weather warmed, medieval people hoped for good fortune, but they also knew that even the best laid plans could be thwarted by nature's whims. For many, the arrival of spring was a time of cautious optimism, as people hoped for a good harvest and the restoration of their resources. But it was also a time of uncertainty. As the earth thawed and the days grew longer, medieval people had to face the reality that the survival of their community, their family, and their future depended on the fragile balance of nature. The cold of winter had been a brutal opponent, but the warmth of spring could also be just as dangerous. In the end, spring was not simply the end of winter. It was a reminder of the delicate balance that medieval people had to maintain in order to survive. The transition from winter to spring was not a return to normalcy, it was a moment of uncertainty and perseverance. It was a time when hope and fear mixed together as people looked forward to the new season, but remained wary of the challenges that could still arise. As we continue our journey through the brutal reality of medieval winters and the delicate transition into spring, we now find ourselves at a critical juncture. The time of rebuilding is in full swing. The cold has subsided, the land is thawing, and the physical labor of preparing for the new season is underway. The earth is beginning to show signs of life. But as people in medieval communities turn their attention toward planting crops and mending their homes, they face not only the lingering effects of winter, but also the profound challenges that came with the seasonal shift. It's a time of great effort and anticipation, but it's also a time of heightened danger. The medieval approach to survival relied heavily on the rhythms of nature. For all the efforts put into preparation, gathering firewood, preserving food, and cultivating the land, the unpredictability of nature still loomed large. A good harvest could mean survival, but a failed crop or a late frost could spell disaster. The slightest mistake, the smallest misjudgment, or the faintest shift in weather patterns could push a community from abundance to famine in a matter of weeks. The shift from winter to spring may have brought some relief, but it also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges. Challenges that were just as severe as the cold that had come before. One of the most significant concerns as spring arrived was the possibility of frost. While the thawing of the earth opened the door for planting, it also posed a danger to newly sprouted crops. Late frost could destroy tender shoots, leading to crop failures that would have lasting consequences for the entire community. Crops like wheat, barley, and oats, which were essential to the survival of medieval people, were particularly vulnerable to cold snaps in early spring. These were the very crops that provided the bulk of food stores for the year ahead, and without them, people were left scrambling for other resources. The delicate balance of nature already tested by the long winter could easily be disrupted by one final cold snap. Medieval people, with their reliance on farming and agriculture, had a deep understanding of the risks and challenges of these early spring months. They watched the weather patterns, closely observing the signs in the sky, the behavior of animals, and the temperature of the soil. While they didn't have modern weather forecasting tools, they relied on centuries of accumulated knowledge to predict when the frost might strike. Farmers knew to plant crops later in the spring to avoid the risk of a sudden frost. They also employed various techniques to protect their crops, such as using frost cloths or creating windbreaks to shield their fields. But even with all their wisdom, they could not completely avoid the whims of nature. The uncertainty of the weather was a constant companion, and people often held their breath during this crucial time, hoping that their crops would make it through the unpredictable early spring conditions. The unpredictability of weather was just one of the many dangers people in medieval communities faced. Even as the land thawed and crops were planted, there were still threats lurking beneath the surface, threats that were just as insidious as the cold itself. One of the most significant dangers was disease. The crowded conditions of medieval homes, combined with the close proximity of people and animals, created a perfect environment for the spread of disease. The long, harsh winter had already weakened many people, leaving them more susceptible to illness. The cold also made it difficult to keep things clean and sanitary, leading to the buildup of waste and filth. By the time spring arrived, many people were already weakened by malnutrition, exhaustion, and exposure to the elements. When spring rains arrived, they often brought with them a surge in pest populations. Insects, rats, and other vermin would come out of hiding, ready to feast on the crops that had just been planted. The increased moisture from the thawing ground provided the perfect breeding ground for these pests. Fields that had been carefully tilled and planted could be overrun with insects that chewed through crops, or worse, rodents that destroyed entire food stores. The struggle against pests was a year-round battle, but spring brought a particular urgency as the future of the year's harvest was at stake. Medieval farmers had to deal with a constant cycle of planting, weeding, and protecting crops from pests, tasks that required skill, knowledge, and an unrelenting dedication to survival. The arrival of spring also brought the return of wild animals that had been dormant during the winter months. These creatures, such as wolves, wild boar, and deer, could pose a threat to livestock, especially young animals that were born in the early months of spring. For many medieval people, livestock was not just a source of food, it was a vital part of their economy and way of life. A lost cow, sheep, or pig could mean the difference between surviving the year or struggling to make ends meet. The loss of animals also meant a loss of resources: meat, milk, wool, and leather, making it even harder to endure the unpredictable months ahead. For communities living near forests or in more rural areas, the return of wild animals was a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. The forest, while providing food and materials for firewood, was also home to dangerous predators. The same forest that offered shelter to wild boar could also conceal wolves or other carnivorous animals, which could venture into villages to hunt livestock or even prey on people. Protecting the animals was an ongoing battle. And the arrival of spring often meant that this battle intensified as wildlife became more active. However, it wasn't just the physical dangers that medieval people faced during this time of transition. It was the mental toll of anticipating the future. People spent the long winter months struggling to survive, and when the thaw finally came, they faced the uncertain future with the knowledge that survival was still not guaranteed. Spring, while a time of new growth, was also a time of anxiety. The success of the new crops, the survival of the animals, and the arrival of warmer weather all depended on factors beyond the control of medieval people. The pressure to ensure the success of the coming year's harvest weighed heavily on everyone. Even the smallest mistake, planting too early, not protecting crops, properly could result in disaster. Yet despite all the challenges and uncertainties, the spring months were also a time of renewal. The thawing earth, the budding trees, and the first flowers that bloomed provided a glimpse of hope after the darkness of winter. People, while cautious, also embraced the arrival of warmth and light. Spring was a time when the cycle of life began again. The fields that had been barren for so long were now filled with the promise of new crops. The fresh, crisp air and the longer days gave people a renewed sense of energy. It was a time for growth, not just in the physical world, but in the spirit as well. For medieval people, spring was a reminder that life, no matter how hard, continued. It was a time to rebuild, to plant, and to hope for a better year ahead. But spring was not without its own set of dangers. The early months brought with them the risk of floods which could ruin crops and leave communities stranded. The thawing of ice and snow often led to rapid runoff, causing rivers to swell and overflow. For those living near rivers or streams, these floods could wipe out homes, fields, and even livestock. In some cases, entire villages were destroyed by the sudden rush of water. These floods were particularly dangerous because they were unpredictable. Unlike a drought or a cold snap, floods could occur with little warning, leaving people with no time to prepare. And once the floodwaters receded, the damage was done. The fields were ruined, the food stores washed away, and the land left unusable for months. Even with the arrival of warmer weather, the dangers of spring never fully subsided. The crops that were planted in the early days of the season were vulnerable to late frosts, which could damage or kill delicate shoots. The arrival of pests combined with the potential for disease meant that the fight for survival continued, even after the frost had thawed. The mental toll of living in a world where everything was uncertain, the weather, the crops, the animals, was profound. Medieval people didn't just fight against the cold of winter, they fought against the very unpredictability of life itself. As we conclude this chapter of medieval survival, it's clear that the transition from winter to spring was not an easy one. The physical labor, the mental strain, and the constant worry about survival weighed heavily on everyone. The arrival of spring brought with it the hope of a new season, but it also brought with it the knowledge that the struggle was far from over. For medieval people, survival was a constant battle, one that began with the arrival of winter and continued long into the warmth of spring. And as the cycle of seasons repeated itself, one thing was always certain: the fight for survival would never end. As the days lengthened and the earth began to thaw, medieval people faced a moment of reprieve. But the lingering effects of winter still clung to their lives. Even as crops began to grow and animals became more active with the arrival of spring, the impact of months spent fighting against nature's wrath remained palpable. The resilience of the people who lived through these times, enduring the endless winters, struggling through the hardest parts of the year, was tested as the seasons shifted. It wasn't just about surviving the physical aspects of nature's cycles. It was about the deep social and psychological resilience that allowed communities to rebuild year after year. In this section, we'll delve into how medieval people adjusted their social structures to deal with the aftermath of winter and how their societal systems, religious practices, and resilience played a vital role in helping them continue. One of the most critical aspects of survival in medieval times was community cooperation. While it's easy to think of medieval life as being characterized by isolated farming communities, the reality is that survival often depended on the strength of the bonds between neighbors, extended families, and even villages. These communal systems were especially vital during the transition from winter to spring, when the challenges of survival hadn't yet disappeared. The cooperation among individuals during the long, cold months was often what made the difference between life and death. The winter months, while harsh and isolating, also served as a time for people to depend on each other. People shared what little food they had, helped with firewood collection, and supported each other during the worst of the cold. But spring was a time when this communal effort transitioned into preparing for the future. The work of plowing fields, sowing crops, mending fences, and rebuilding homes after winter's toll required every hand in the community. Social bonds were crucial during this time. People couldn't afford to be divided. If one family failed to contribute, the whole village risked going without. The communal effort was not just a matter of necessity, it was a social contract, a binding agreement to ensure that the survival of the collective came before individual concerns. However, this period of cooperative survival was fraught with its own set of challenges. The labor demands during the spring months were immense, and the strain of the past winter left people physically weakened. Not only had they dealt with the cold, but many had suffered from malnutrition illness or injuries sustained during the harsh season. Spring's arrival brought renewed hope, but it was also a time when the physical toll of winter could no longer be ignored. People weren't just picking up the pieces from the winter's destruction, they were contending with their bodies' inability to handle the intense work ahead. Historians still argue about how medieval social structures and hierarchies were affected by seasonal cycles. Some argue that the cold and isolation of winter reinforced social divisions, particularly between peasants and the nobility, as the latter often had the resources to survive more comfortably. Others believe that the communal nature of medieval life, especially in villages, led to a greater degree of social mobility, where people from different social strata worked together to ensure the survival of the group. In any case, the challenges of spring and the fragile hope of the coming harvest didn't care about social divisions. They affected everyone from the wealthiest landowners to the poorest peasants. The threat of hunger and the uncertainty of the coming year's crops were universal. In addition to this social structure, medieval people's religious practices played a crucial role in their ability to cope with the transition from winter to spring. Religion, which pervaded every aspect of medieval life, offered both comfort and practical guidance. The church was more than just a place of worship, it was a community center, a place to gather and a vital source of social and emotional support. During the long winter months when people felt isolated and exhausted, the church provided solace and a sense of purpose. When spring arrived, the church played a critical role in helping people transition from the hardships of winter to the hope of a new season. Medieval Christianity was built around the rhythm of the seasons. The church year, with its liturgical calendar, was deeply tied to the agricultural cycle. Feast fasts and holy days were often connected to important moments in the agricultural year, providing people with a sense of structure and ritual. Spring, for example, was marked by festivals celebrating renewal fertility and the return of warmth. These celebrations were not just spiritual, they were communal events that brought people together to reinforce bonds and mark the end of winter's hardships. Easter, in particular, was a time of great significance, celebrating the resurrection and offering a powerful symbol of renewal and rebirth. The rituals and ceremonies surrounding Easter provided a moment of spiritual and social revitalization, allowing people to share their hopes for the coming season and reaffirm their faith in the face of uncertainty. But while religion offered hope, it also reinforced the hierarchical structures of medieval society. The church was an integral part of the social and political fabric of the time, and its teachings often supported the existing power structures. For the peasant class, the church provided both comfort and a reminder of their place in the world. The clergy, often wealthy and influential, had a significant role in guiding not only the spiritual, but also the practical aspects of daily life. The church's authority was vast and its influence was especially powerful during times of hardship, when people were more likely to turn to faith for answers and guidance. However, religion was not the only source of comfort and guidance during this transition period. Medieval people also relied on a range of superstitions and folk beliefs to help them navigate the challenges of early spring. These beliefs, passed down through generations, were deeply rooted in the everyday lives of peasants and townspeople alike. While the church provided spiritual guidance, these folk practices offered a more practical approach to dealing with the uncertainties of nature. The arrival of spring was marked by rituals designed to protect crops, livestock, and homes from harm. People hung charms, made offerings, and performed rituals to ensure good fortune in the months ahead. Some communities believed that certain plants like herbs and flowers had protective powers and would keep evil spirits or misfortune at bay. Others relied on more complex rituals such as burning effigies or creating protective symbols at the entrances to their homes. These beliefs were often tied to ancient pagan customs that had been absorbed into Christian practices over time. One of the most important aspects of these superstitions was their ability to provide people with a sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. The unpredictability of nature, the possibility of bad weather crop failure or disease, was a constant source of anxiety. Folk practices gave people a way to exert some influence over their environment, even if it was symbolic or based on belief rather than reality. These practices provided comfort and a sense of agency, helping to alleviate the mental toll of the transition from winter to spring. Even as medieval people relied on communal efforts, religion, and folk practices to help them survive, there was also a darker side to spring. The optimism of the season was tempered by the awareness that even in a time of renewal, survival was never guaranteed. The physical and emotional toll of the past winter lingered. People were exhausted, physically weakened by the cold and malnutrition, and the threat of disease was still very much present. The spring brought new life, but it also brought the continued struggle to ensure that this new life would survive. This struggle was felt most keenly by the poorest members of society. For them, the arrival of spring didn't necessarily mean relief. It often meant the beginning of another cycle of uncertainty. While the wealthier classes might have had reserves of food and resources to last them through the spring, the poor relied on the success of the harvest to get by. The success of the crops determined whether they would have enough food, firewood, and other resources to survive until the next season. A failed harvest could mean another year of hardship, while a successful one offered the hope of survival. But that hope was always fragile, always dependent on forces beyond their control. The poor also faced another significant challenge during the spring months: disease. The damp, wet conditions of early spring provided an ideal environment for the spread of illness. Medieval people had a limited understanding of how diseases spread, and the crowded conditions of villages where people lived in close quarters with animals made it easy for illness to spread quickly. The arrival of spring brought with it a rise in illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and respiratory infections. The trauma of winter had left many people weakened, making them more susceptible to illness. Once spring rains arrived, disease became an even greater threat. The fragile optimism of the spring season, then, was balanced by a deep awareness of the fragility of life itself. The medieval mindset, shaped by years of living on the edge of survival, was one of cautious hope, not certainty. The future was never guaranteed. The crops might fail, the weather might turn foul, disease might strike. And yet, despite all the uncertainty, medieval people kept going. They kept planting, kept working, and kept praying. They endured because, in the end, endurance was all they had. As we look back on these brutal realities of medieval life, it's clear that spring, far from being a time of carefree renewal, was a season that demanded resilience, cooperation, and faith. The trials of winter had been harsh, but the challenges of spring were just as severe. Yet through it all, medieval people found ways to survive, to persevere, and to rebuild. They lived in a world where every season, whether cold or warm, brought new struggles, but it also brought new opportunities. And it was in the struggle to survive in the fight, to continue, that their true strength was revealed. As we progress further into the dynamic relationship between the medieval seasons and the communities that lived through them, we now arrive at a pivotal point in the cycle of survival spring's early full bloom. While the frost may have finally receded, it would be a mistake to assume that the worst was over for the medieval communities. The complexities of the early months of spring were far more than a simple transition from one season to another. The struggles of the past still lingered, and the challenges of the future remained to be faced. Now, as the fields began to sprout with new life and animals ventured out from their winter sanctuaries, medieval communities turned their attention toward the unseen forces that threatened their survival: pest, disease, and the unpredictable weather. In many ways, spring for medieval people was a battle against forces beyond their control. As the thawed earth provided the hope of new crops, it also revealed the vulnerability of those very crops to a wide range of threats. It was a time when every single plant had to be carefully tended to and protected. Despite the optimism that came with the longer days and warmer weather, the dangers that cropped up during these early months could undo all the hard work of the past season. If medieval people could not successfully navigate the pressures of early spring, everything they had worked for and hoped for would be lost. One of the greatest risks was pests. After months of cold and isolation, insects and rodents would reemerge in full force, ready to destroy the crops that had just been planted. As the first shoots of wheat, barley, and oats broke through the soil, farmers had to be vigilant in protecting their fields from a variety of pests. The most obvious culprits were insects, aphids, locusts, and caterpillars that could quickly strip plants of their leaves and damage or destroy an entire crop. While we may now think of these pests as merely annoying for medieval farmers, they were the embodiment of catastrophe. The damage caused by an infestation could be devastating, particularly for the peasantry, who depended on every crop to survive the year. Historically, medieval people used a variety of methods to combat pests, though many of these techniques were based on trial and error rather than scientific understanding. Some farmers relied on physical barriers, such as using nets or fences to protect their crops from larger animals like rabbits or boars. Others would plant companion plants such as marigolds to repel insects, or mask the scent of more vulnerable crops. Folk remedies, including the use of herbs, were also common. Certain plants were believed to ward off pests, and medieval farmers would scatter them around their fields to keep the bugs at bay. However, these methods were not always effective, and the absence of chemical pesticides meant that the success of a crop depended largely on the luck of the weather and the severity of the infestation. The vulnerability of crops was not just a matter of pests, it was also about the weather. After surviving the unpredictable nature of winter, medieval people were left to face the potential for unpredictable spring weather. Though the arrival of warmth was a welcome relief, it also brought with it the possibility of storms flooding and late frosts which could decimate fields that were just beginning to show signs of life. The soil freshly thawed was still temperamental, and a sudden, cold snap could halt the growth of new plants, freezing them into a state of dormancy until the warmth returned. Medieval farmers were keenly aware of this danger, and they spent sleepless nights watching the weather, hoping the temperature would hold long enough for their crops to become established. Historians still debate the extent to which weather patterns affected medieval agriculture. Some argue that climate change, particularly the cooling associated with the Little Ice Age, made these spring frosts even more frequent and severe, leading to more widespread crop failures. Others believe that the unpredictability of the weather was simply a fact of life that medieval people had learned to live with. Whatever the case, the harshness of the seasons and the unpredictability of the elements remained an ever-present challenge. The combination of pests and erratic weather made crop management a precarious business. Despite their best efforts, medieval farmers were often at the mercy of these forces. It wasn't unusual for an entire harvest to be ruined by a single storm or a sudden infestation. For the wealthy, these crop failures were often manageable. They could buy or trade for what they lacked. But for the poorest peasants, a failed crop meant hunger and possibly even death. The risks of agriculture were a fact of life, and every harvest, every planting, brought with it the fear that disaster could strike at any time. Yet for all the challenges that spring brought, there were also opportunities. The warmer weather allowed for more work to be done, and the soil once frozen and unyielding could now be cultivated. Spring's arrival also brought with it the chance to rebuild. The long months of winter had taken their toll on homes and barns, and the warmth of spring gave people the opportunity to repair what had been broken during the cold months. Roofs were patched, fences mended, and homes restored to make them livable once again. The labor-intensive nature of this work was taxing, but it was necessary for survival. While the fields were being worked, the animals that had spent the cold months in barns or stables were being brought outside. This was a crucial time in the cycle of medieval life, as the health of livestock determined the well-being of families. Horses, cattle, sheep, and goats were essential to survival, providing food labor and clothing materials. The arrival of spring meant that the animals would begin to calve or lamb, offering the hope of new additions to the herds. But even the arrival of new life came with risks. The cold of the winter months had weakened many animals, and diseases could spread quickly in the crowded barns and stables. Medieval farmers had to keep a close eye on their livestock, ensuring that they had enough food, water, and shelter to make it through the early spring months. At this point, people were also dealing with the toll that the harsh winter had taken on their own health. After months of battling the cold and surviving on what little food had been preserved, many people found themselves weakened and sick. Malnutrition was a constant problem during the winter, as the stored food would run out and fresh produce was not available. The lack of vitamins and nutrients left many people susceptible to illness, and the early spring months were often marked by the spread of disease. Crowded living conditions, poor sanitation, and the cold all contributed to the spread of illnesses which could sweep through communities with terrifying speed. Even the arrival of warmer weather couldn't prevent the constant threat of disease. Medieval people had little understanding of hygiene or disease transmission, and their reliance on animals for food labor and warmth meant that they were constantly exposed to germs and bacteria. Springtime was often the season when illness would strike hardest as weakened immune systems made people more vulnerable. Diseases like the plague, cholera, and dysentery could devastate entire villages, particularly in rural areas where medical care was scarce. For medieval people, spring wasn't just a time of planting, it was a time of reckoning. The challenges of the past winter, the toll that the cold had taken on people's bodies, and the ever present fear of disease and crop failure all made the early months of spring a period of deep anxiety. Communities had survived the long winter, but survival didn't mean safety. It meant that another set of challenges awaited them. The promise of a successful harvest was tenuous, and the arrival of new life in the form of animals and crops brought with it new risks. People were caught in a constant cycle of hope and fear, working tirelessly to ensure their survival in a world that remained unpredictable. Despite the grim realities, there was still hope. As the fields began to fill with crops and animals started to roam freely again, people took comfort in the rhythm of nature. The earth, after months of dormancy, had come alive once more. The trees began to bud, the flowers bloomed, and the air became thick with the scent of new growth. This renewal gave people the strength to continue their work, to persevere in the face of adversity. Spring, despite all its risks, was a time of renewal, a time when the promise of a new cycle of life pushed people forward. But the true test of survival would not come until the harvest. The months leading up to the harvest were marked by uncertainty, but they also carried with them the promise of reward. The seeds that had been planted were now growing, and the labor that had been invested in the fields would soon be tested. For medieval people, spring was a time of hard work, but also a time of anticipation. It was the beginning of the end of the struggle, the point at which the fruits of their labor would be revealed. Would the harvest be enough to sustain them through the next winter? Would the crops grow tall and strong? Or would they wither under the weight of the season's challenges? These were questions that loomed large in the minds of everyone who worked the land. In many ways, spring was the ultimate test of endurance. The cold of winter had pushed people to their limits, but it was the warmth of spring that would determine whether they had made it through. The season offered the promise of renewal, but it also held the potential for loss. In the end, survival was never guaranteed, but it was in spring that people's hopes, fears, and resilience came together. It was a time of rebirth, but also a time of reckoning. The transition from winter to spring, while a time of renewal, was also a time of reflection. As the earth began to warm and the last remnants of snow melted away, the medieval people who had survived the long, brutal winter found themselves at a crossroads. While the return of warmth brought the promise of growth and the hope of new life, it also meant that the hard work of survival continued. Every aspect of life in medieval times was defined by the cycles of nature, and the struggle to stay alive was constant. Despite the seasonal change, the challenges of the past were still fresh in people's minds. In this section, we explore the complex web of emotions, social dynamics, and strategies medieval people used to cope with the aftermath of winter, as well as how these seasonal transitions shaped their relationship with the world around them. For medieval people, spring was not simply a season of celebration, it was a season of anticipation, hope, and worry. After enduring months of cold isolation and the physical toll of winter, the first signs of spring brought an overwhelming sense of relief. The sight of fresh grass pushing through the earth, the smell of blooming flowers, and the warmth of the sun on their faces offered a sense of renewal. But with this renewal came a new set of challenges. The work of preparing the fields, tending the crops, and safeguarding livestock was still ahead. The struggle for survival was far from over. The medieval world was fundamentally agrarian. Whether one was a nobleman overseeing vast estates or a peasant struggling to make ends meet, the rhythms of the seasons were paramount. It wasn't just about surviving the immediate challenges of the present, it was about preparing for the future. Spring was a crucial time for planting crops, a process that would determine not only the coming year's food supply, but also the economic stability of entire communities. In many ways, spring planted the seeds not just for the crops of the year, but for the survival of the entire community. A failed spring harvest could lead to famine, social unrest, and even death. This knowledge hung over the heads of all medieval people, rich or poor. The anxiety of spring was particularly palpable among peasants. Unlike the wealthier classes who could store up resources, trade for food, or seek outside help, peasants were wholly dependent on their immediate environment. Their lives were lived on the edge. One bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death. For peasants, survival was a daily struggle, and the transition from winter to spring was no different. It was a time of rebuilding, but also a time of deep uncertainty. Would the soil be fertile enough to yield a successful harvest? Would the weather hold out, or would storms and flooding destroy the crops? Would disease decimate the livestock? Even as the laborious tasks of planting, weeding, and protecting crops began, the social dynamics of medieval communities came into sharp focus. It was in spring that the communal nature of medieval life became most apparent. This was a time for villages to come together to ensure the success of the coming year's harvest. Neighbors shared tools, labor, and knowledge, working together in the fields to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. This communal spirit was essential to survival. While some may have been fortunate enough to have larger estates or better land, the cooperation of the community as a whole was what allowed many to endure the harshest seasons. At the heart of these cooperative efforts was the church. Religion and the church were central to medieval life, and during the spring months they played a crucial role in providing structure, support, and hope. The church was a source of spiritual solace, but it was also a place for people to gather, exchange news, and offer help to one another. This social glue helped maintain cohesion within villages and provided the mental and emotional support needed to continue. Religious festivals during spring, such as Easter, celebrated renewal, life, and growth concepts that resonated deeply with the society that relied so heavily on the cycles of nature. As the church and its rituals offered comfort and guidance, it also marked time-giving structure to the often chaotic cycle of life and death in the medieval world. However, it was not just the church that provided this sense of connection. The folk traditions and practices of the medieval people also had a vital role to play in maintaining social bonds. As the land came alive in spring, people participated in various folk rituals designed to ensure good fortune for the crops and the community. These rituals, often a mix of pagan beliefs and Christian practices, were held in fields, forests, and homes. People would often perform dances, sing songs, and offer sacrifices to the earth, the spirits, or their gods. In this way, the return of life in the form of crops and animals became a cause for collective celebration, even as the threat of disaster still loomed large. In addition to the communal aspect of spring, there was also the deep connection people had to the land. The medieval world was inherently tied to the natural world. People didn't just live in the world, they were part of it. The earth, the seasons, the animals, the plants, the weather, they all played a role in determining the fate of individuals and communities. The cycles of nature were understood not just as external forces, but as forces that governed all aspects of life. The soil was seen as sacred, and the land was treated with reverence. When crops grew, people celebrated. When they failed, people mourned. The fertility of the earth was seen as a direct reflection of the will of God or the gods, and it was understood that one could not survive without it. As spring arrived, the medieval people's relationship with the land was tested in a new way. The soils that had been frozen solid just weeks earlier were now soft and malleable, ready to be worked. The rains came nourishing the earth and turning the once barren fields into productive areas of agriculture. Farmers worked tirelessly to plant seeds, hoping that the weather would cooperate and the crops would take root. However, just as nature had the power to provide, it also had the power to destroy. The unpredictable nature of weather meant that people were never truly safe from disaster. Spring, in its promise of renewal, also contained the seeds of future ruin. Beyond the crops, the physical toll of spring was also deeply significant. Medieval people, having survived the challenges of winter, were now faced with the grueling labor of the new season. The work of planting was physically demanding, requiring hours spent in the fields under the hot sun. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and maintaining the land all demanded immense effort. For many peasants, this physical labor was compounded by the toll of the previous months. Malnutrition, illness, and physical exhaustion meant that many people were not in optimal condition to take on the strenuous work of the spring season. And yet, despite their fatigue and weakened state, they pressed on, driven by the need to survive. This period of intense labor also contributed to the psychological toll of medieval life. The stress of not knowing whether the crops would survive, combined with the physical exhaustion of the work, created a unique strain on the people. Survival wasn't just a matter of being physically strong, it required mental fortitude as well. The fear of failure, the dread of famine, and the pressure to succeed weighed heavily on the minds of those who worked the land. There was little room for error. The rhythm of work, while necessary for survival, was also a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. But even amidst these challenges, there were moments of respite. The arrival of spring brought with it the promise of new life crops. Animals gave birth, and the earth came alive in ways that seemed magical to the medieval mind. The sight of a field full of healthy, thriving crops or a barn filled with newborn lambs and calves provided hope for the coming months. Spring, though fraught with danger, was also a time of optimism. The work was hard, but it was the work that ensured survival, and it was this work that connected medieval people to the land, to each other, and to the larger forces of nature. In a world where everything seemed uncertain, the arrival of new life was a symbol of endurance and possibility. While spring was undeniably a time of great physical and emotional strain, it was also a season of profound transformation. The transition from the harsh, cold winter to the warmer, more productive months of spring was a metaphor for the larger process of survival in the medieval world. Each season, each cycle brought with it new opportunities, but also new threats. The struggle for survival never ended, it simply shifted form. The promise of a new harvest was always present, but so was the threat of failure. It was this constant tension between hope and fear, between life and death, that defined the medieval experience. Ultimately, spring represented not just the renewal of the earth, but the renewal of the spirit. It was a time when people could look forward to the possibilities of the coming months, even as they remained acutely aware of the challenges they would face. Spring, with all its beauty and potential, was a time of reckoning, a time when the hard work of survival had to be undertaken anew. It was a time when the will to endure had to be stronger than the weight of uncertainty. a time when hope had to overcome fear. In this way, the cycles of nature mirrored the cycles of life itself: birth, growth, decay, and death. These were not just abstract concepts, they were lived realities woven into every facet of the medieval experience. The transition from winter to spring was just one of many transitions, but it encapsulated the essence of survival. The work of the past, the toil of the present, and the hopes for the future were all wrapped up in the delicate balance of the seasons. Spring, despite its challenges, was a time to reflect on the past, to live in the present, and to look forward to what was yet to come. As spring fully unfurled across the medieval landscape, a sense of gradual hope and palpable tension took root in the hearts of all those who relied on the land for survival. The rituals of planting were well underway, and as the earth turned soft beneath plows and seeds were carefully sown into freshly tilled soil, a quiet optimism began to grow. Yet amid this burgeoning optimism, medieval communities, while aware of the blessings of a new season, were also weighed down by the harsh truths of what lay ahead. The struggle for survival was far from over, and even as the landscape shifted to a greener hue, the shadow of uncertainty remained a constant companion. In many ways, spring was an expression of the cyclical nature of life in the medieval world. Seasons of growth, followed by seasons of loss, always balanced on the edge of hope and fear. For medieval peasants, this delicate balance shaped every aspect of their existence, from the work of the fields to the rituals and practices they employed to ensure the survival of their families and communities. The medieval world did not allow for complacency, and the promise of spring was a fragile hope sustained only by hard work, deep faith, and a collective determination to overcome the numerous challenges that lay ahead. As the crops began to grow, so too did the sense of urgency among the medieval population. While the early spring season had been spent preparing the land and planting the seeds for the year ahead, the late spring and early summer months brought a new challenge: protecting these delicate crops from the natural dangers that could destroy them. For farmers, this was the season of constant vigilance, as the very crops that had been so carefully sown and nurtured could be quickly wiped out by the whims of weather pests and diseases. Even as the earth seemed to respond to the sun's warmth, the question of whether enough would grow to ensure a successful harvest lingered heavily in the air. The most immediate threats to crops during this period were pests, an omnipresent menace for medieval farmers. While the medieval world did not have access to modern pesticides or pest control methods, people still had an acute understanding of the dangers posed by insects, rodents, and other pests. From the first spring shoots to the mature plants in midsummer, farmers worked tirelessly to ward off the many creatures that sought to feast on their crops. Rodents in particular were a significant problem, as rats, mice, and voles were adept at burrowing into stored grain, destroying harvests before they had even left the field. In addition to rodents, insects like aphids, beetles, and locusts posed a major threat. These pests could strip plants bare, devouring the leaves and stems that were essential for growth. Insects were often so prolific during the early summer months that it could feel as if the very air was filled with them. Farmers, especially in areas that had experienced abundant rainfall, found themselves fighting a constant battle against these invaders. Some people employed traditional methods of pest control, such as hanging herbs like lavender and rosemary around their fields, believing that the scent would repel insects. Others tried physical deterrents, such as using nets or fences to keep larger pests away from their crops. These methods, though somewhat effective, were rarely foolproof. A large infestation could decimate an entire crop in a matter of days, leaving the community without vital food stores for the coming winter. Meanwhile, the weather itself was a persistent, ever-present threat. Late frost and early spring were still a possibility in many regions as temperatures could fluctuate wildly. A sudden frost, even after the crops had begun to sprout, could cause devastating damage. A night of freezing temperatures could freeze tender shoots, halting their growth and causing irreparable damage. Farmers kept a careful eye on the weather, often using signs from the natural world like the behavior of animals or the patterns of wind and clouds to predict what might come. However, without the modern tools of meteorology, even the most seasoned farmer could not predict with absolute certainty whether their crops would survive the early spring chill. In addition to the challenges posed by pests and weather, the ongoing threat of disease loomed large. The harsh winter months had weakened many people's immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. Spring brought with it the rise of diseases like dysentery, cholera, and the plague which could spread rapidly through densely populated communities. The medieval understanding of disease was limited, and the absence of sanitation meant that disease could flourish in the unsanitary conditions of the villages. The fact that people lived in close quarters with animals, shared communal wells, and disposed of waste in rudimentary ways made the spread of disease even more likely. Once a plague began to spread, it was difficult to contain, and it often had devastating effects on entire villages. The toll of disease was particularly high during the spring and early summer months, when people were working in the fields exposed to the elements and to the dust and dirt of agricultural labor. The combination of exhaustion, poor nutrition, and exposure to disease meant that the weakest members of society, children, the elderly, and the sick, were particularly vulnerable. Many families face the heartbreaking reality that despite their best efforts to survive, they might lose a loved one to illness in the coming months. With all of these external pressures weighing on them, medieval people turned to their communities and religious practices for support. The church remained a central figure in their lives, providing not only spiritual comfort but also practical assistance. Religious festivals and ceremonies offered a brief respite from the relentless labor of spring, giving people the opportunity to come together, share in communal meals, and express gratitude for the return of warmer weather. These festivals, often centered around the agricultural cycle, reinforced the connection between the people and the land and offered a momentary break from the constant cycle of work. At the heart of these religious observances was the belief that survival depended not only on human effort but also on divine intervention. Medieval people prayed for favorable weather for the health of their crops and for protection from pests and disease. They offered sacrifices, made vows, and performed rituals to ensure that their fields would be productive and that their animals would thrive. In this way, religion provided a sense of control over the forces of nature, offering people a framework through which they could make sense of their struggles. It gave them something to hold on to when their efforts seemed futile and their survival uncertain. The social dynamics of medieval life were deeply intertwined with religion, and religious festivals helped maintain the social fabric of the community. These communal events were opportunities for people to reaffirm their bonds with one another, to celebrate shared experiences, and to offer mutual support. The cooperative spirit that had emerged during the winter months continued into spring as people worked together to protect their crops, share resources, and ensure the survival of the community as a whole. The success or failure of the season depended on the collective effort of everyone involved. This period also saw a greater degree of dependence on the local economy and trade networks. While wealthier individuals could rely on their estates and surpluses to see them through the leaner months, the poorer members of society depended on their ability to trade goods and resources with one another. The success of spring planting not only affected the harvest but also determined the strength of the local economy. If crops failed or resources were scarce, the entire village could face economic collapse. This economic vulnerability led to tensions and, in some cases, conflict. Some villages took measures to protect their food supplies, hoarding resources for themselves or demanding higher prices for goods. The stress of ensuring that everyone had enough to eat created competition between neighbors, and in more desperate situations, even violence could break out. The arrival of warmer weather also marked the start of more intensive agricultural labor. While planting had been the primary focus of early spring, the coming months demanded more constant attention. Weeding, tending, and protecting crops from pests would become the full-time job for most. This grueling labor was necessary to ensure that the harvest would be successful, but it took its toll on the people involved. Farmers already exhausted from the long winter now faced the physical strain of working long hours in the fields under the sun. Despite the reward of a potential harvest, the labor required was often overwhelming, and many people fell ill from overwork or malnutrition. Even with the heavy demands of agriculture and the looming threat of pests and disease, the people of medieval communities maintained a strong sense of resilience. They had survived the worst of the winter months, and now they would push through the hardships of spring, driven by the hope that their efforts would yield fruit in the months to come. Yet the danger was never far from their minds. Spring was a season of both renewal and threat. It was a time when the seeds of hope were planted, but also a time when the specter of disaster was never too far behind. The delicate balance of hope and fear, of effort and outcome, defined the medieval experience during these months of transition. As people turned their attention toward the harvest that lay ahead, they understood that their survival and that of their communities depended on their ability to work together to endure and to weather the many challenges of the season. They knew that the arrival of warmth and sunlight did not guarantee safety. Survival in the end was not guaranteed by nature, it was guaranteed by their collective strength, resilience, and determination. As we leave behind the fields of early spring, we can see how the cycles of the medieval world, rooted in the rhythms of nature, faith, and community, shaped every aspect of life. Even as the earth sprang to life again, medieval people understood that the struggle to survive never truly ended. It was a continuous cycle where each season brought with it new challenges, new hopes, and new opportunities. And it was in the endurance of these cycles and the strength to keep moving forward that the resilience of medieval people was truly forged. The spring months, with their hopeful beginnings and hidden dangers, soon gave way to the intense and demanding warmth of summer. As the crops matured and the landscape bloomed with life, medieval people found themselves caught in a delicate balance of optimism and anxiety. The early summer months were a critical period in the medieval agricultural cycle, a time when the success of the entire year's labor could either bear fruit or fall apart under the weight of natural forces beyond their control. By the time summer arrived in full force, medieval peasants and landowners alike faced the intensity of the growing season, watching the crops they had nurtured during spring mature while simultaneously guarding against the ever-present risks of pest disease and extreme weather. The stakes were high and the work was unrelenting. While the promise of harvest lay just around the corner, the medieval world was still at the mercy of nature. Summer, while representing the peak of growth, was also the season of uncertainty. As the crops reached their most critical stages of development, medieval farmers knew that now was the time to be vigilant. Any error in timing, any delay in the harvesting process, or any untimely change in weather could ruin months of hard work and leave the community vulnerable for the coming winter. The first major challenge that medieval people faced during the summer months was the relentless heat. Unlike the harsh cold of winter, the heat of summer often caught people off guard, especially in regions where summers could be intensely dry. The ground that had been so cooperative in spring became hard and dry, and if rainfall was insufficient, crops could suffer from a lack of moisture. In parts of Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean and southern regions, long hot summers were marked by extreme droughts that could turn fertile land into barren wastelands. Farmers who had once looked to spring as the season of hope now found themselves praying for the rains to come. Summer heat also brought with it the risk of fire. With the dry conditions, fires were a constant threat to the crops, homes, and barns of medieval people. Even a single spark from a poorly maintained hearth could ignite a field, leading to devastation. Forests, too, were a source of danger, especially when people ventured into them to collect firewood or gather resources. The heat combined with dry vegetation made wildfires a seasonal risk that people constantly had to be aware of. In a time when firefighting resources were limited, preventing a fire from spreading to homes and food stores was a matter of life or death. But it wasn't just the weather that medieval people had to contend with during the summer months. It was also the resurgence of pests. By now, many of the crops planted in spring had grown tall and healthy, but they were not without their dangers. As the warm weather settled in, insects and other pests became active, eager to devour the crops that had been painstakingly nurtured. One of the most persistent problems was the attack of locusts, which could destroy entire fields of wheat, barley, and other essential crops in a matter of hours. A locust swarm could be so dense that it would block out the sun, leaving crops bare and villages hopeless. To combat the pest problem, medieval farmers employed a range of methods, both practical and superstitious. Some relied on physical barriers to prevent insects from getting into their fields, such as the use of nets or fences. Others planted companion crops plants that were known to repel certain pests or attract beneficial insects. Some even employed folk remedies, such as using herbs or concoctions to keep insects at bay. But for all these efforts, the fact remained that pests were often unstoppable. Medieval people lived with the knowledge that a single infestation could destroy their year's work, forcing them into even greater uncertainty and desperation. The presence of animals also added to the summer stresses. While livestock was an essential part of the medieval agricultural system, their care during the summer months was not without difficulty. Animals, particularly those that grazed on fields, needed constant monitoring. In areas where livestock were allowed to roam freely, they could easily trample the crops that had been carefully planted. A single herd of sheep or cattle could easily destroy an entire year's harvest, if not carefully contained. This was a time when communities had to work together to protect both their crops and their animals, sometimes relying on communal watchmen or shepherds to keep the livestock in check. While the physical demands of agriculture continued, medieval people also had to contend with the growing risk of disease during the summer. As the weather warmed, illnesses like dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera became more prevalent, particularly in densely populated areas. With people living in close quarters and little knowledge of hygiene, diseases spread quickly, and summer brought with it the heightened risk of epidemics. The increased presence of insects also meant that diseases carried by animals and insects, such as the plague and malaria, were more likely to take root. The threat of disease wasn't just a matter of human illness, it was also the risk that animals could carry diseases that affected crops and livestock. The summer months were marked by heightened vigilance as medieval farmers and villagers kept an eye on the health of their animals. Any signs of illness or infection could lead to the culling of livestock, which in turn would lead to an even greater risk of food shortages in the winter months. The role of veterinarians was not as developed as it is today, and many medieval communities relied on folk medicine and remedies to treat their sick animals. The results were often mixed with some methods providing temporary relief, while others simply failed to deliver. For the peasants and the landless summer also represented a season of heightened labor. The work of planting had already been done, but now the fields required constant tending, watering, weeding, and managing the soil to keep it fertile. The pressure to ensure that everything was in order during the growing months was immense, as a poor summer harvest could have far-reaching consequences. Not only would it affect the immediate survival of families and villages, but it could also affect the broader economy. With trade routes often unreliable and access to resources limited, the success of the harvest became even more critical. In many ways, the summer months were defined by labor and vigilance. While the physical work of sowing had already been completed, the threat of crop failure, disease, and pests loomed large. Medieval farmers had to stay on alert, constantly working to protect what had been planted to ensure that crops were properly nourished and cared for. It was a season of intense physical and emotional stress as people relied on the land, not only to provide food but to maintain their way of life. The communal nature of medieval life meant that people worked together to manage the growing season's challenges. However, this cooperation didn't always come without its own tensions. Resources were limited, and as the summer months progressed, the pressure to produce enough food and supplies increased. Competition among neighbors for access to land, water, and tools became more pronounced. The less fortunate peasants often found themselves struggling to keep up with the demands of the season, and even the wealthier landowners faced the pressure to deliver successful crops in order to maintain their position of power. It was a time when the success of the season could directly impact a family's or village's social and economic standing, leading to both cooperation and rivalry in equal measure. For the wealthier classes, summer represented a different kind of challenge. While they were not typically involved in the day-to-day labor of agriculture, the land they controlled required management. The noble classes relied on peasants and laborers to work the land, but they also had to ensure that their estates were well maintained and that the workers were provided for and kept in good health. The noble class could afford to take a more distant approach, but they were still acutely aware of the importance of the summer months. Without a successful harvest, their estates would falter and their wealth would be jeopardized. In some ways, the pressure on the nobility to maintain their land was just as great as the pressure on peasants to grow crops. As the summer months continued and the first signs of a successful harvest became more apparent, there was a sense of cautious optimism in many medieval communities. The crops were maturing, the livestock were growing stronger, and the labor-intensive work of the season was beginning to pay off. Yet the uncertainty that had defined every season before still lingered. The possibility of storms, the sudden appearance of pests, or the outbreak of disease still threatened to undermine all of the hard work. Even in the face of all the hope that came with a growing harvest, there was still a constant awareness that nature had the final say. The future of the medieval world was always in flux, and despite the promises of summer, medieval people remained vigilant. It wasn't enough to simply survive the early months of spring. It was about ensuring that the work of planting bore fruit. The reality of summer labor was that it was a constant struggle against time, against nature, and against the unpredictability of life itself. Each season, whether it was the bitterness of winter or the heat of summer, tested the resolve of medieval communities. Yet through it all, they continued driven by the basic instinct to survive, to endure, and to make it through to the next season, knowing that they would be tested again and again. The summer season, though, offering a sense of progress with crops growing, and the land beginning to show its promise was far from the calm and carefree season one might envision. By the time the height of summer arrived, medieval communities were not resting easy. In fact, they were working harder than ever. The key to survival in the medieval world rested on maintaining a delicate balance between hope and anxiety labor and rest faith and fear. The temperature had risen, the sun was relentless, and the growing crops were becoming more vulnerable with every passing day. This critical juncture, where the land had provided promise and growth, was now a period of intense labor and vigilance. The heat of summer made it physically grueling to keep up with the work required to protect crops, maintain fields, and ensure that everything was set for a successful harvest. The complexity of the medieval agricultural system, where food production was intricately tied to the survival of communities, meant that farmers and laborers alike had little room for complacency. Every action, every decision made during this period had consequences, and failure to respond quickly or effectively could mean the difference between a successful harvest and famine. As we explore this further, it's crucial to understand the nuanced relationship between medieval people and their environment during these summer months. The sense of urgency that came with the growing season wasn't simply a matter of pushing through the work, it was about understanding the ecosystem timing and carefully calibrating human action with nature's rhythms. Whether it was adjusting to the hot sun or responding to pests, medieval people were in many ways playing a delicate game of prediction and timing. One of the primary concerns during the summer months was ensuring that crops received enough water. Although medieval people didn't have the advanced irrigation systems that modern agriculture boasts, they were keenly aware of the need for moisture in the soil. As the summer sun baked, the earth fields became increasingly dry. The relentless heat could quickly cause crops to wither, especially if rain was sparse. People living in areas with natural rivers or streams had an advantage, but for many rural villages and small communities, access to water could be a major issue. Farmers relied heavily on rainfall to nourish their crops, but if the weather was uncooperative, they had to find alternative ways to deal with the dry conditions. One traditional method used was the practice of waterlogging the fields. This technique involved temporarily flooding areas with water to soak the ground. It was labor-intensive, requiring water to be transported in buckets or barrels to designated fields. This was a time-consuming method that often required community cooperation, people working together to carry water from streams or wells to the crops. The work was exhausting, especially during the heat of summer, but it was an essential practice when nature didn't provide enough moisture on its own. However, the practice of waterlogging wasn't always effective. If rainfall was insufficient for long stretches, the crops could still suffer, and entire fields might be lost to drought. This phenomenon was most apparent in southern Europe, where the Mediterranean climate was characterized by long, dry summers. Farmers in these regions knew that a failed crop could spell disaster for their community, and it was during these months of intense heat that they relied on their inherited knowledge of the land and weather patterns to manage their resources as best they could. Even in regions that received adequate rainfall, there were other threats that could derail the prospects of a successful harvest. The rapid rise in temperatures brought about by summer heat waves could increase the risk of wildfires, a danger that medieval communities were all too familiar with. The drier conditions made the landscape especially vulnerable, with fields, forests, and even villages at risk of catching fire. Medieval people, particularly those living in rural areas, were keenly aware of the risk posed by fire. With few firefighting resources and little ability to control the spread of flames, many communities relied on fire breaks, areas of cleared land, where vegetation was removed to prevent fire from spreading. For many medieval farmers, livestock was just as critical to survival as crops. Summer was a time when the health of animals which had been sheltered from the harsh cold of winter had to be carefully monitored. The warmth of summer and the increased grazing opportunities provided an excellent time for animals to grow strong, but it was also the time when livestock faced the most danger. In addition to the risk of disease, animals were vulnerable to heat stroke, dehydration, and overexertion. With limited access to water and grazing, it was often difficult for farmers to provide enough sustenance for their animals, especially as the summer heat drained the resources of the land. The challenge of providing for animals was made even more difficult by the problem of parasites. Summer was the season when ticks, lice, fleas, and other pests were most active, and the presence of these parasites could cause a range of health issues for livestock. Illnesses such as anthrax, a bacterial infection, and various parasitic infections were more common in the summer months and posed significant risk to the health of both farm animals and people. Farmers relied on a combination of preventative measures, including herbal remedies and rudimentary sanitation practices. But these methods were often ineffective and disease could spread rapidly through the livestock population. As the summer progressed, communities began to see signs of what would become a crucial part of their survival. The grain fields beginning to ripen, the vegetables reaching maturity, and the animals growing fat for slaughter. While the hope for a bountiful harvest was high, the threat still lingered and the work was far from finished. The primary task in the late summer months was the continued vigilance needed to ensure that crops were protected. Farmers in medieval times had little time for rest during this period. The days were long and the labor was intense, requiring all hands on deck. Everyone in the household, from the children to the elderly, was involved in the work. Whether it was tending the fields, preparing food for the coming winter, or caring for the animals. One crucial aspect of late summer was the preservation of food. With the crops reaching their peak now was the time to harvest what could be preserved for the coming winter months. Medieval people relied on preservation techniques like drying, salting, and pickling to ensure they had enough food to last through the cold months. For peasants, the ability to successfully preserve food could mean the difference between life and death. Preserving the harvest wasn't just about storing food for the future, it was about securing the resources necessary to survive the winter when fresh food would be scarce. In addition to food preservation, the late summer months were a time for preparing the home for the harsher months ahead. The heat of summer made it easier to work on tasks that required outdoor labor, such as repairing roofs, reinforcing fences, and gathering firewood. Medieval homes, especially in rural areas, were often made of wood or stone and were prone to damage over the winter months. The late summer was an ideal time for repairs before the harsh winds and cold temperatures of autumn and winter made such tasks nearly impossible. These repairs were not simply about comfort, they were about survival. A roof that leaked during the winter could lead to mold rot and even structural collapse. If fences were not in good repair, livestock could wander off, causing both economic and food-related hardship. Every detail of life had a direct bearing on the community's ability to survive the coming seasons, and so the work continued ceaseless, demanding, and essential. As we look closer at the physical labor required during these months, it's clear that summer was a time of immense effort. It was a season that demanded constant work from dawn to dusk. But it wasn't just physical endurance that was required, it was also mental resilience. Medieval people lived in constant awareness that their survival depended not only on the immediate conditions of the weather, but also on their ability to respond effectively to the ever-changing risks. The growing season in late summer was a reminder of how fragile life was. For every person working tirelessly to ensure a successful harvest, there were others in the community who might not make it through to the next season. Disease, pests, poor weather, and accidents could all affect the outcome of the harvest. What medieval people understood more than anything was the tenuous nature of their existence. Each day, each decision could either build toward a successful harvest or lead to disaster. The communal spirit of late summer, as the community rallied around the labor of the fields, was not just a collective act, it was a crucial lifeline for survival. The sense of shared responsibility of collective effort permeated every aspect of life. People relied on one another not only to share the work, but also to share in the success or failure of the harvest. It was in these moments of community labor that the strength of medieval society was tested. While the late summer brought with it the promise of harvest, it also brought a foreboding reminder of the risks that would continue to challenge medieval communities. The labor of the summer month was relentless, but so too were the ever-present dangers posed by nature. Even as crops grew tall and the promise of harvest neared, the people of the medieval world knew that survival was never guaranteed. The rhythm of life, marked by seasons of growth and decline, was not just a reflection of nature's cycles. It was a reminder that every year brought with it the struggle to live, to thrive, and to endure. As the summer reached its peak and the first signs of harvest began to appear on the horizon, medieval communities were not only facing the physical demands of agriculture, but also the emotional toll of uncertainty. The intense work of planting, weeding, watering, and protecting the crops during the warm months had left little room for respite. However, now with the growing season beginning to yield its first fruits, the farmers and laborers could begin to take stock of what had been accomplished and what still remained at stake. The coming harvest represented the culmination of months of effort, and it was in these moments of anticipation that the harsh realities of medieval life came sharply into focus. The medieval harvest season was fraught with risks. Even as the crops began to ripen, there was no guarantee that the final yield would be enough to carry communities through the winter. The risk of pest, disease, bad weather, and even theft could undermine the entire year's labor. Farmers whose livelihoods were tied directly to the success of the harvest faced an overwhelming sense of pressure to protect their crops. It wasn't just a matter of harvesting the grains, it was about protecting the future of the entire community. A failed harvest could lead to hunger, social unrest, and even death. The threat of pests continued to be a significant concern during the late summer and early autumn months. While the majority of crops had grown to maturity, the risk of damage from insects, rodents, and other creatures remained. The growing crops were vulnerable at the moment of harvest when they were most exposed. Rodents, particularly rats, could invade grain stores, destroying food that was meant to last through the winter. Insects like aphids, grasshoppers, and locusts posed an even more immediate threat with their voracious appetites, capable of devastating entire fields of crops in a matter of days. The warmer summer temperatures and the rise of moisture in the air created ideal conditions for insect infestations, and without effective pest control, farmers could see their hard work undone in an instant. Medieval farmers had learned to adapt to these threats over centuries using a combination of folk remedies, physical barriers, and careful observation of nature to minimize the damage done by pests. But despite their efforts, pests were never fully under control. Farmers relied on the community to help monitor and protect the crops. In many rural areas, villagers worked together during harvest time to ensure that fields were carefully watched. They would clear away any pest by hand-use scarecrows to deter birds and even build simple traps to capture rodents. However, these methods were never foolproof, and there was always the risk that a particular infestation would overwhelm the community's efforts. In addition to the constant vigilance required to manage pests, the threat of disease remained a grave concern throughout the summer months. Just as crops were susceptible to being ravaged by insects and animals, they were equally vulnerable to blight and other diseases. Medieval farming techniques, while innovative in their own right, lacked the scientific knowledge required to fully understand plant diseases or prevent their spread. Fungal infections such as mildew or rust could spread through a field, causing the crops to wither and die. The most dangerous diseases were often bacterial, which could spread quickly and destroy an entire crop before the farmer even realized there was an issue. Late summer was also the time when the threat of weather extremes became particularly palpable. Storms, floods, and unexpected cold snaps could completely destroy crops in a matter of hours. The medieval world was at the mercy of weather patterns with no reliable forecast to help farmers prepare for extreme events. A single severe storm could ruin a season's worth of work, and communities that depended on trade and exchange of goods were also vulnerable to market fluctuations caused by crop failures. In some years, poor harvests in one region could lead to food shortages elsewhere, exacerbating the risk of hunger and malnutrition. Even though medieval communities had developed systems to respond to weather-related challenges, they were often powerless in the face of extreme events. Droughts in southern Europe, floods in northern Europe, and storms across the Atlantic could all disrupt the agricultural cycle, and the results were often devastating. Farmers, with their hands tied by the vagaries of nature, did what they could to mitigate the damage, but in many cases they were left praying for mercy. Despite these constant threats, medieval people carried on with their work. The pressure to ensure the success of the harvest was immense, but there was no other option. For most people in medieval communities, the harvest represented their livelihood and their survival. There was no backup plan, no storehouses filled with ready-made food to draw from in times of crisis. Instead, communities banded together to protect each other's fields, pool resources, and share the bounty of the land. These communal efforts were crucial to survival, but even they weren't enough to guarantee success. As the harvest season approached, a palpable sense of urgency settled over the land. The labor of the past year was about to culminate in either success or failure. For the majority of the population, the harvest marked the end of months of hard work and the beginning of a new phase in the cycle of survival. The community would come together to gather the grains, store the food, and prepare for the leaner months ahead. For medieval people, the harvest was more than just a crop, it was a lifeline. It was the thing that made life possible, and they could not afford to fail. At the heart of the harvest was the work of the laborers. The timing of the harvest was critical, as it required the collective effort of every member of the community. While landowners and nobles often supervised the process, it was the peasants and the landless who did the physical labor. The work of harvesting was grueling, with long hours spent in the fields, cutting down the ripe crops, bundling them, and preparing them for storage. This was not a time for rest. It was a time of intense, backbreaking labor. The physical toll on workers was immense, but it was also necessary for survival. Once the crops were harvested, the next challenge was storage. Medieval storage methods were rudimentary but effective in many cases. Grain was often stored in large wooden bins or in barns, and families relied on cool, dry spaces to keep their food safe from pests and spoilage. Despite these efforts, the risk of spoilage was always present. The slightest change in temperature or humidity could lead to mold or rot, rendering entire stores of food inedible. The threat of rats and mice was ever present, and medieval people took great pains to protect their food from these pests. Traps, barriers, and poisons were used to protect grain and other foodstuffs, but these measures were never foolproof. In addition to food storage, there was the matter of preserving other resources like firewood. The winter months were always a challenge when it came to maintaining heat in homes, and without adequate firewood, people could face unbearable cold. The late summer was the time to gather firewood, ensuring that there would be enough to last through the winter. Wood was gathered from nearby forests or from dead trees that had fallen during the previous year's storms. Gathering firewood was a communal effort often carried out by entire families or groups of neighbors. However, even with these efforts, firewood was never an unlimited resource, and communities had to balance their needs carefully. Even as the harvest season came to a close, people continued to work tirelessly. The promise of the harvest was never certain, and the threats that loomed large in the summer months were still present. As the season turned toward autumn, people could only hope that their labor had been enough. The work of the harvest was more than just a physical task, it was a symbolic act of survival. It represented the culmination of months of effort and the hope that the community's work would pay off. For medieval communities, the harvest was not just a time of celebration, it was a time of reckoning. The stakes were incredibly high. A failed harvest meant not just hunger, it meant a complete breakdown of the way of life. Communities had little recourse when disaster struck. Without modern technology weather forecasting or the ability to transport large quantities of food, there were no backup plans. Every effort had to be made to ensure that the harvest would be successful. And once the harvest was over, the work of preparing for the next winter began almost immediately. The medieval harvest season is a reminder that survival is not just about the immediate. It's about planning for the future, about ensuring that every action you take now will contribute to your survival in the months and years to come. For medieval people, every season brought with it new challenges, new uncertainties, and new opportunities. But the harvest, with its risks and rewards, was always the most significant. It was the defining moment of the year, a time when hope, labor, and resilience came together to determine whether the community would thrive or falter. Through the harvest, medieval people proved their endurance and their will to survive. But as the season drew to a close and the work of gathering, storing, and preparing for winter began, they also knew that their survival was never guaranteed. The cycles of nature, for all their predictability, remained as uncertain as ever. And yet, in the face of it all, medieval communities continued, driven by the collective effort, the unyielding hope, and the resilience that defined their existence. As autumn arrived, bringing with it a crispness to the air and a sudden clarity in the light, medieval people found themselves facing the culmination of an entire year's labor. The harvest, the fruit of their sweat resilience and careful work, was almost at hand. The fields, now stripped of their bounty, offered the promise of survival for the coming months, but it was a promise tinged with uncertainty. While autumn's cool breath offered a reprieve from the brutal heat of summer, it was also a time when the medieval world began to prepare for the harsh reality of winter. This was the season of final preparations, the gathering of the last resources, the storing of food, the care of animals, and the inevitable realization that the cold, dark months of winter were not so far off. Autumn marked a critical turning point in the annual cycle of survival. It was a season of transition, a time when the fullness of the year's work became either a promise fulfilled or a hard-earned lesson in the fragile nature of life. The harvest itself, though a moment of triumph, was also a moment of reckoning. Was there enough food to see the village through the long winter? Were the firewood stores sufficient? Had enough grain been saved for the next planting season? And perhaps most crucially, would the coming winter bring the harsh conditions that medieval communities had long feared? The season of autumn, though filled with physical labor and collective effort, was also filled with the weight of reflection as people turned to the future with both gratitude and anxiety. One of the most important aspects of autumn in medieval society was the storage of food. The harvest once gathered had to be carefully processed and preserved. The medieval world had no refrigeration, and there was little room for waste or error. If the food wasn't stored properly, or if there wasn't enough to last through the winter, the community faced the very real threat of starvation. Preservation methods were rudimentary but effective for the time. Grain was stored in large wooden bins or granaries carefully packed to prevent it from being infested by pests like rats, mice, and insects. The grain had to be kept dry and cool, but in an era before modern silos and sealed containers, that was not always possible. Medieval people relied on their experience and knowledge of the land to select the best spots for storage, choosing places that were cool and well ventilated. While grain was one of the most important staples, there were other foodstuffs that needed to be preserved as well. Meats were salted or smoked to extend their shelf life, while fruits and vegetables were dried or pickled for storage. The medieval world's dependence on preserving food meant that the entire harvest had to be managed with great care and precision. A poor harvest or improper preservation techniques could result in families going hungry. Even the wealthier classes who had access to larger stores of food were vulnerable. No one was truly safe from the uncertainty that came with the transition from autumn to winter. However, it wasn't just food that had to be carefully managed. Autumn also brought with it the crucial task of gathering firewood for the cold months ahead. In a world without central heating or modern sources of warmth, fire was absolutely vital for survival during winter. It provided warmth, a means to cook food, and light during the long nights. Gathering firewood was a physically demanding task, and it was one that required both time and effort. Autumn was the best time to gather wood as it was cooler than the sweltering heat of summer, and it was easier to chop wood before the ground froze. In rural areas, entire communities often worked together to cut, haul, and store enough firewood to see them through the winter. But firewood wasn't always the only resource that needed to be managed during autumn. The medieval world was a time of intense labor, and every resource, whether it was firewood, food, or tools, had to be conserved, maintained, and carefully prepared for the future. Tools had to be sharpened and repaired, clothing had to be mended, and shelters had to be reinforced. The physical demands of the autumn months were exhausting, but they were essential for ensuring survival in the coming months. The process of preparing for winter was deeply communal. In medieval villages, no one could afford to ignore their role in ensuring the survival of the community. Neighbors worked together, sharing labor and resources. They relied on one another to help with the heavy lifting of gathering food, securing firewood, and completing other tasks necessary for the coming season. The importance of this communal work cannot be overstated. It wasn't just about survival, it was about solidarity. It was about each person contributing what they could, ensuring that the whole community would make it through another harsh winter. And yet, despite the communal nature of this work, autumn was also a time of great tension. The harvest was only as good as the work done throughout the year, and the amount of food stored determined how well each family and each community would survive the coming winter. The specter of famine was always present. A bad harvest, late frosts, or unexpected weather could doom an entire village to hunger. Even in good years, the fragile balance between resources and survival was always in flux. Moreover, as the days grew shorter and colder, the fear of disease returned. The crowded conditions of the medieval world, poor sanitation, limited understanding of disease, and the close proximity of people and animals created the perfect environment for epidemics to spread. In medieval communities, the arrival of autumn also meant the arrival of seasonal illnesses, particularly respiratory infections and intestinal diseases. The stress of the harvest and the physical toll of preparing for winter weakened the immune systems of many. As people worked to prepare for the cold months, they often found themselves vulnerable to illness. Families who were already struggling with malnutrition, exhaustion, or injury were particularly susceptible to diseases that would spread rapidly through overcrowded homes and poorly kept living conditions. Disease was one of the great unknowns of medieval life. There was no understanding of hygiene, no knowledge of how diseases were spread, and no vaccines or modern treatments to rely on. The medical knowledge of the time was rudimentary at best, relying heavily on superstition, herbal remedies, and religious practices. When illness struck, it could decimate entire families or villages. Those who survived the hard work of the harvest could find themselves undone by a sudden outbreak of sickness. In addition to disease, there was the ever-present threat of violence. Though the summer months had seen the end of the yearly raids and skirmishes that often plagued medieval communities, autumn brought with it the threat of violence tied to the scarcity of resources. In some regions, particularly in areas affected by political instability or social unrest, autumn was a time when bandits and marauders would attack vulnerable villages. With food stores being gathered and stored, it was an opportune time for thieves to raid. The fear of theft and loss could lead to tensions between villages with communities struggling to protect their resources. This social dynamic added yet another layer of anxiety to an already stressful season. While medieval people could not escape the harshness of the world they lived in, they had developed systems of resilience and hope that allowed them to face these uncertainties. Through religion, community, and a deep connection to the land, they managed to carry on. The church, as we've seen, provided spiritual solace during these difficult times, offering people a sense of control over their environment, even if they could not control the weather, pests, or disease. The church also provided a framework for communal gatherings, opportunities for neighbors to come together, share news, and offer mutual support during these uncertain months. Autumn also provided the opportunity for reflection. As people gathered the fruits of their labor, they couldn't help but look back on the month that had come before. The challenges of the past winter and the early spring had left their mark. But despite the hardships, the resilience of the people was a testament to their strength. The harvest, while uncertain, was proof that the community had done all they could to prepare, and now it was time to trust in the work of their hands and the support of their neighbors. The coming months would bring their own set of challenges, but in that moment, as the harvest was brought in and the firewood stacked, there was a sense of accomplishment. The final weeks of autumn marked a turning point, the point at which preparation gave way to hope. The first frost was often just around the corner, and with it the real work of preparing for the long winter began in earnest. But despite the cold, despite the looming threats of illness, pests, and hunger, the medieval world found ways to survive. Communities banded together. Neighbors helped neighbors. And despite the trials they faced, they persevered, holding on to the fragile hope that the future would be kinder than the past. As autumn turned into winter, the promise of the harvest became even more important. For medieval people, it wasn't just about having enough food for the coming months, it was about preserving what little they had. It was about the ability to endure, to fight through adversity, and to hold on to hope in a world that often seemed indifferent to their struggles. And through it all, the cycle of seasons, with its moments of growth, loss, and survival, continued to shape the way people lived. Even as the cold winds of winter began to blow, medieval people understood that survival was not just a matter of food or warmth. It was about the spirit of resilience, the strength to face each new challenge, and the unwavering determination to persevere. As winter's inevitable approach grew closer, the once vibrant and bustling fields began to quiet, signaling a stark change in the rhythm of medieval life. The bright, industrious days of late summer and autumn were over, and the community now found itself preparing for a very different kind of season. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the preparation for the cold months ahead reached its peak. For medieval people, this transition wasn't just about a shift in weather. It marked a complete change in the type of work and the kind of vigilance needed to survive. The work of the field slowed, but the work of winter preparation was intensifying. And for the peasants, this was a time of both relief and dread. The first frost had already come and gone, and the once lush landscape now lay bare, waiting for the grip of winter to fully settle in. People in medieval communities had only a short time left to finish their preparations before the cold weather made it impossible to work outdoors. The harvesting and storage of food were in their final stages, and the last of the firewood had to be stacked and stored before the heavy snow made it difficult to access the forest. Now, with the preparations nearly complete, the mental toll of winter loomed large. Medieval people lived in a state of constant awareness of the changing seasons and the cyclical nature of life. The arrival of winter was a time when all their labors throughout the year would either pay off or fall short. The harvest, the preparation of food and firewood, the care of animals. All these things determined whether the community would thrive or struggle during the cold months. This was a time of reckoning, a time when every effort mattered, and failure was not just inconvenient, it was potentially deadly. But even with all the hard work done, the knowledge that survival still depended on factors beyond their control created a sense of anxiety. The medieval people understood that winter was an unpredictable beast. The weather could be kind, or it could be harsh. Pests could still invade, diseases could still spread, and the very foundations of the community could be shaken. The final weeks of autumn into early winter represented a season of stillness, both physically and emotionally. The agricultural labor had slowed, but that did not mean people were resting. Far from it, winter preparations took on an entirely different character. The crops had been harvested, but now the food needed to be preserved and stored in a way that would last through the long months ahead. The wood that had been chopped needed to be kept dry and stacked efficiently to ensure the hearths stayed warm. Animals which had been kept sheltered from the worst of the cold needed to be looked after, as their care would be crucial to survival during winter. The livestock needed to be fed and their pens reinforced to ensure they remained safe and protected. During this time, the work of survival was fundamentally different. It was no longer about planting seeds or tending crops, it was about conserving what had been harvested. Food needed to be carefully rationed, and every meal, every morsel became an important part of the equation for how well the community would fare. The medieval winter diet was focused on preserved food, salted meats, dried grains, vegetables that had been stored in root cellars, and pickled goods. Even with everything preserved, medieval people had to be conscious of how they used their food, as running out of supplies meant the difference between surviving the winter or succumbing to hunger. The cold temperatures that set in during early winter also brought with them a renewed sense of urgency in terms of the protection and safety of homes. Medieval houses were often poorly insulated, with walls that allowed the cold air to seep through and roofs that could leak when snow accumulated. These homes, despite being shelter from the wind, often left their inhabitants vulnerable to the elements. The work of repairing and reinforcing homes became crucial in these final weeks of autumn. The roofs needed to be patched, the doors and windows sealed, and the chimneys cleaned to ensure they functioned properly. Even small cracks in the walls or holes in the roof could make the difference between staying warm and being exposed to the bitter cold. During the medieval period, the protection of the home was not just about physical comfort, it was also a matter of survival. A poorly maintained house in the middle of winter could quickly become a death trap, especially if the temperature dropped too low or if snow piled up around the door. The presence of animals in the home, chickens, pigs, and other livestock, was often crucial in terms of providing warmth, but it also meant that the space would be crowded and the air would be thick with smoke dust and warmth from the fire, all contributing to the discomfort of the inhabitants. Despite this discomfort, the warmth of the hearth was the only source of heat that many could rely on to stay alive through the long, dark nights. But it wasn't just the homes and food supplies that needed to be protected. Winter also meant the return of disease, and the medieval world had no concept of viruses or bacteria in the way we understand today. What medieval people did know was that during the colder months, illness spread faster. The close quarters of the homes, a lack of sanitation, and the weakened state of many people's health from the strain of the past seasons created ideal conditions for sickness to spread. The poor, malnourished, and elderly were especially vulnerable, and it was common for entire families or communities to suffer from the spread of disease during the colder months. The constant worry about disease added to the stress of preparing for winter. The onset of cold weather brought with it the threat of the flu, respiratory infections, and other ailments that medieval people were ill-equipped to manage. Even worse, medieval medicine was rudimentary at best, relying heavily on superstition, herbal remedies, and the spiritual belief that illness was a punishment from God or the work of evil spirits. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no understanding of how diseases spread. If one person fell ill, it was likely that many others would be affected. The mental toll of preparing for winter was just as significant as the physical labor. After months of intense work in the fields, a sense of weariness pervaded the air. The constant threat of failure, of running out of food or firewood, weighed heavily on people's minds. The work of winter preparation, while necessary, was exhausting and unrelenting. For many, the long nights and cold days created a sense of isolation and despair. Without the ability to escape the cold or find relief, the psychological strain of the season could be overwhelming. Many medieval people suffered from what we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. SID, a form of depression that was triggered by the long, dark winter months. Despite the hardships, there were small moments of reprieve. The early winter months were a time for socializing, feasting, and engaging in communal activities. The long nights, while isolating, also created opportunities for families and villages to come together. The communal feasts of early winter were often centered around the abundance of food that had been harvested and stored. These gatherings allowed people to celebrate the fruits of their labor, share resources, and reinforce the bonds that held the community together. Religion played a central role in these moments of reprieve, with Christmas and other seasonal festivals, offering a spiritual break from the hardship of daily life. These festivals were not only times of religious observance, but also opportunities for communities to gather, sing, dance, and share in collective joy. But despite these occasional moments of joy, medieval people knew that the worst was yet to come. Winter had a long way to go, and it was a season that brought with it a great deal of uncertainty. The long months of cold, the risks of illness and disease, the possibility of food shortages, and the constant need to stay vigilant all weighed heavily on people's minds. This period was not just about surviving the immediate hardships, it was about enduring. The mental and emotional toll of preparing for winter, The pressure to protect what little the community had and the fear of what might come in the months ahead created a profound sense of collective anxiety. Yet, despite these challenges, the resilience of the medieval world is clear. Each year, communities would face the same cycle of challenges, some years more difficult than others, but through it all they endured. Winter in the medieval period was a time of hardship, a time when survival was uncertain and the struggle to stay alive was constant. But it was also a time when the bonds of community were tested and strengthened. The labor of preparing for winter was grueling, but it was necessary, and through the shared efforts of the people, through the collective spirit of resilience, medieval communities found ways to survive. The struggles of winter were harsh, but they also brought people together, giving them the strength to endure and the will to push through until the seasons began their cycle again. As winter tightened its grip, medieval communities entered a season of true endurance where the effects of all their hard work and preparation would finally show their true weight. The long nights and frigid temperatures which had been anticipated and feared were now in full force. The early preparations of autumn, the harvest that had been carefully gathered, the firewood stored high and the food packed away were all that stood between survival and destruction. Winter for medieval people was not just a season, it was a crucible. The season that separated those who would make it to the spring from those who would fall short struggling until their resources ran out. It was a time when the fragility of life, the tenuous balance between abundance and starvation, became most apparent. The mental and physical toll of the cold was immense. The homes, often poorly insulated and made of timber stone or wattle and daub, were inadequate against the harsh conditions. Even with the warmth of a fire, the cold seeped into every corner. The hearth, the center of life for medieval people during the winter, provided heat but could never fully warm the house. The smell of smoke permeated everything: clothes, food, and even the air. It wasn't just about staying warm, it was about protecting against the constant grinding cold that made everything feel like an uphill battle. Each night that passed in the freezing darkness brought with it the same chilling uncertainty about whether the fire would last through the night, whether the food stores would hold, or whether the family members could endure one more bitter day. Even with the comforts of a fire and a roof over their heads, people in medieval times found that surviving winter required far more than just material resources. It required resilience, patience, and the ability to endure. The hours spent huddling together trying to keep warm were often filled with reflection on the season that had passed and what the future might hold. There were very few distractions to offer relief from the weight of these thoughts. The long winter nights stretched on endlessly, and for many this was a time when isolation, despair, and fear could easily take root. While food supplies were the primary concern, medieval people also had to constantly be on alert for the risks that came with a harsh winter. The dangers of winter were many frozen roads made travel almost impossible, and if a family needed assistance from a neighboring community, it could take weeks or months before help arrived. The long periods of isolation made it even more difficult to survive. In many areas, the proximity to other villages or towns could be a matter of life or death, as more distant communities lacked the means to offer timely help in an emergency. Even the simple act of traveling for food or firewood could become a perilous journey when roads were iced over or snowed in. Another challenge, though it seems almost inconsequential today, was the fragile connection to the outside world. During the winter, medieval communities often felt more cut off from the larger world, as transportation routes were blocked or halted completely. In some areas, trade came to a standstill, and merchants were unable to deliver goods or bring supplies from other regions. This left many communities vulnerable, relying entirely on what they could grow or store. If a community did not have enough food, there was no quick way to replenish it. For peasants, this meant that survival depended entirely on the planning and preparation made months before. The risk of starvation was a constant companion. Despite the communal work that went into preparing for winter, a failed harvest, a poor crop of grains, or any unforeseen event such as a wildfire floods or locusts could reduce the stores that families depended on. The importance of preserving the grain, meat, and vegetables that had been harvested was critical. Cattle, sheep, and poultry were also necessary, providing milk, eggs, and meat, but even their survival was not guaranteed in the winter months. Harsh temperatures, disease, and the need for constant feed made them vulnerable to suffering, and if livestock perished, so too would the livelihoods of those who depended on them. Winter also tested the strength of medieval families who faced the brutal reality of what it took to care for the elderly, the sick, and the very young. Medieval communities often had to manage with what they had, and there was little room for error. If a member of the family fell ill, it was a tremendous burden on the group, especially during the cold months. The lack of knowledge about germs and disease combined with close living quarters and unsanitary conditions made sickness a recurring threat. The cold aggravated ailments such as pneumonia and the inability to leave the home for medical help made treatment virtually impossible. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and disease, particularly respiratory and digestive illnesses, spread quickly during the winter. The mental toll on individuals and families was perhaps just as dangerous as the physical threats they faced. The isolation of the winter months brought with it a deep psychological strain. The lack of sunlight, the closed-off nature of their homes, and the physical hardships of daily life led many people into depression or a state of despair. Medieval people often looked to religion for solace during these dark times, praying for health, for food, and for deliverance from the worst of what winter could bring. They believed that their survival was largely in the hands of God, and so many turned to the church for comfort during the cold months. The spiritual practices of the time, which included prayer, fasting, and religious observances, became an essential part of coping with the winter's hardships. For medieval communities, the role of religion was not limited to spiritual needs. It was also a critical part of their physical survival. The church provided the social structure necessary for survival during the cold months. Not only did it serve as a source of spiritual support, but the church also organized communal gatherings, charity, and aid for those who needed help. While the wealthier families could often withstand the cold with relative comfort, the poor relied on the support of the church and their neighbors to ensure that they survived. In addition to its spiritual role, the church often acted as a central hub for community life during the winter months. Even as the cold made outdoor gatherings difficult, the church served as a place where villagers could come together for warmth, to exchange goods and share resources. During the lean months, the church became the heart of the community's social and economic life. It was also the place where people gathered for festivals and special religious observances, offering them a much-needed reprieve from the hardships of winter. The church provided not just food and resources, but the hope and mental support needed to get through the coldest days. Yet, as the winter wore on, even the warmth of communal gathering could not entirely dispel the fears of starvation or disease. As the long dark nights stretched on, the villagers turned inward, huddled close to the hearth, and remained ever watchful of their resources. The first snow had fallen and was here to stay, transforming the landscape into an inhospitable world of white and gray. Even the animals that had once roamed freely had retreated to their shelters, their own survival linked to that of the people who tended to them. As much as they prepared, the real challenge of winter was in the unknowns. the unpredictable weather, the risk of extreme cold, and the recurring threat of famine. The cold, once seen as a mere inconvenience, became an omnipresent threat. What if the firewood didn't last? What if disease took another family member? What if the roads remained closed for too long and no one could trade? These fears were woven into every decision, from how much food to ration to how many layers to wear to bed to how close the family huddled around the fire. For many medieval families, winter was a time of scarcity. The weight of survival felt particularly heavy during these months. The food that had been carefully preserved and stored had to last the entire winter. Every piece of grain, every bite of meat, and every root vegetable had to be measured out carefully, and no portion of food was wasted. The fear of running out of supplies created an atmosphere of constant anxiety. Yet there was a certain resilience in this survival mentality. Communities knew that they had no choice but to endure. Winter's cold was also accompanied by the natural rhythms of the world. The cycle of life slowed down people and animals alike, huddled waiting for the warmth of spring. The stillness of the cold months had a numbing effect on medieval communities, but it also allowed for reflection. In the silence of winter, with the world outside, covered in snow, people had a chance to pause. For some, this was a moment to reflect on the hardships endured over the past year and to prepare for what was to come. For others, it was a time to lean into the stillness, relying on each other and their faith to carry them through. The harshness of winter in the medieval world was undeniable. It was not just a season, but a test of endurance, of strength, and of resilience. It was a time when every day, every moment mattered. But despite the challenges, despite the fears and the uncertainties, the medieval world continued to endure. People huddled together, supported one another, and relied on their faith and community to survive. In the long, cold months of winter, there was an understanding that survival was not just about food or warmth. It was about spirit. It was about hope. And it was about the unwavering will to continue. This unrelenting drive to survive, even in the most uncertain and hostile of environments, defined the resilience of medieval people. The winter months stretched on, and despite all of their preparation, medieval communities knew that the true test of endurance had just begun. The struggles of earlier season spring's frost, summer's heat, and autumn's labor had come to a head, and now it was winter's turn to assert its authority over life. As snow continued to blanket the landscape, it became not just a weather pattern, but a defining force in the lives of those who lived under its rule. The cold seeped into every corner of their homes, and the wind howled through cracks in the walls. Yet despite the bitter chill, life had to continue. The struggle for survival was not over, and now more than ever medieval people leaned into the rhythms of their communities, relying on each other to make it through this unyielding season. Winter, as it had for centuries, brought with it the greatest of challenges. The resources that had been carefully preserved through the warmer months now had to withstand the harshest of conditions. Every fire lit, every ration of food shared, every piece of firewood chopped was done with one singular focus: survival. Unlike the relative unpredictability of the growing months, winter offered little leeway. The cold was relentless, and without proper preparation, it could lead to devastating consequences. Those who had not adequately prepared, who had not gathered enough food or firewood, faced dire prospects. For medieval people, the early part of winter was often marked by a constant battle against the elements. The initial shock of cold was only the beginning. The ice, snow, and cold winds began to set in, and people had to quickly adapt to the new environment. Work, which had once been focused on the harvest, and the land shifted to preserving what had been gathered. Fire was the focal point of life. Keeping the hearth stocked, ensuring that warmth could be maintained through the long, bitter nights, these were the tasks that consumed every waking hour. And yet, despite the constant battle against the cold, many found solace in the warmth of their community. The cold of winter drove people closer together, and the firelight was shared not only for warmth, but also for stories for company and for solidarity. Survival during the medieval winter was not simply a matter of enduring the physical cold. The real challenge lay in managing the scarce resources that had been prepared. Food, firewood, and shelter were the triad that medieval people relied on to stay alive. The food stores carefully preserved throughout the year had to last until the first signs of spring appeared. The harsh conditions meant that food spoilage was a constant threat. Once food began to spoil, there was little recourse, there was no refrigeration, and preserved foods were susceptible to rot and infestation. The risks of inadequate food preservation meant that any misstep in preparation could lead to hunger or even starvation. Medieval communities were well aware of the delicate balance required for survival. They had learned to ration and carefully monitor their supplies, but this practice was not without its emotional toll. Every meal became a calculated decision, every portion controlled to make sure that enough remained to last through the lean months. For families, this meant stretching food reserves, eating less, and often reducing portions. This reliance on rationing also extended to firewood. The warmth of the hearth was a lifeline, but firewood was finite. The longer the winter lasted, the more precious firewood became. Families learned to burn only what was necessary, ensuring that their resources were used sparingly. The cold also brought with it the risk of illness. People who had survived the brutal conditions of earlier seasons were now weakened by the stress of winter. The cold, combined with the constant exposure to damp, moldy homes, provided the perfect conditions for diseases like pneumonia, influenza, and respiratory infections to spread rapidly. Without modern medicine, there were no antibiotics to combat infection or vaccines to ward off sickness. People were left to rely on folk remedies and the basic healing knowledge passed down through generations. The vulnerability of the sick and the elderly was especially pronounced, and many did not survive the harsh winters. In addition to illness, the winter months also brought about another silent killer, the psychological toll. The isolation of winter, the lack of sunlight, the endless cold, the confinement of the home could lead to depression and a sense of despair. Medieval people, while focused on the physical challenges of survival, also struggled with the mental and emotional burden of the season. Long, dark nights meant long hours spent indoors. It was a time of reflection, but also a time of restlessness. Without modern distractions like books, television, or social media, medieval people spent the long winter nights huddled together, often with little to do but talk, pray, or wait. For many, this isolation was a significant emotional burden. This psychological strain, however, was mitigated by the strength of community and religion. The church played a vital role in providing structure and comfort during the long winter months. As the darkest days of winter approached, people turned to their faith for solace. Religious observances, attending Mass, praying for deliverance from the harsh winter, and marking the holy days offered a sense of continuity and hope. It was in the church that many found the strength to face another day, to hold on to the belief that their endurance would eventually be rewarded. But even with the support of community and faith, the psychological weight of winter was felt by many. For some, it became too much to bear. The isolation, coupled with the harsh realities of starvation, illness, and physical discomfort, made winter a time when many people found themselves questioning their survival. For those who had lost loved ones or were struggling with illness, Winter was not just a season of physical hardship, it was a time of emotional exhaustion. And yet, despite all of this, life continued. People persevered as they had for centuries. The will to survive, to endure, and to make it through the season was stronger than the weight of fear or despair. One of the most significant challenges of winter was simply the passage of time. The long, dark days seemed to stretch on forever with little to break up the monotony. The lack of daylight affected not only the body but also the spirit. In the medieval world, time was measured by the rising and setting of the sun, and the dark of winter made even the days feel long and sluggish. The absence of sunlight was more than just a physical challenge, it was an emotional one as well. Without the light of the sun, people felt cut off from the world around them. Even in the warmth of their homes, people often felt a sense of separation from the world beyond. This isolation was made even more profound by the lack of modern conveniences. There were no telephones or radios to connect people to the outside world. Communication was primarily face to face, and with travel restricted by snow and ice, people were often cut off from their neighbors. Even within families, there could be a sense of emotional isolation. The long hours of darkness made it difficult for people to find joy or distraction. Without the means to escape the cold and the long, dark nights, it was easy for the mind to turn inward and for feelings of loneliness and hopelessness to take root. The isolation and psychological toll of winter were not just individual experiences, they were shared by entire communities. In many villages, the collective fear of what the winter would bring was palpable. People came together to share resources, to exchange news, and to provide mutual support. The village square, once a bustling place during the warmer months, now stood empty and silent. The homes which in other seasons served as places of social gathering were now more solitary, with families often spending long hours alone in the warmth of the fire. Yet, despite the challenges, there was a deep sense of hope that persisted throughout the winter. The human spirit, even in the darkest of times, found ways to survive. The small moments of joy, shared meals, family gatherings, and religious observances became the glue that held communities together. Even in the coldest and darkest days, medieval people found ways to connect with one another, to share in the labor of survival, and to draw strength from their shared experiences. The harshness of winter, however, was never fully overcome. The season was relentless, and for all the effort made to survive, there were always forces beyond the control of medieval people that could disrupt the fragile balance of survival. The cold, the illness, the pests, the scarcity of resources, these were the constant realities of winter, and they shaped the very fabric of medieval life. Yet through it all, the resilience of the people endured. The cycle of life, though marked by struggle, was also marked by hope. Winter was a time of reflection, a time when the long hours of darkness allowed people to contemplate not only their survival, but also the strength of their communities, their faith, and their own wills to continue. And even though the worst of the season had yet to pass, the lessons learned in these dark months would carry people forward. The ability to adapt, to cooperate, and to endure was what allowed medieval communities to survive the harshest seasons. It was through their shared resilience that they found the strength to press on, waiting for the light of spring, the warmth of the sun, and the promise of a new season of growth. As the cold winds howled and the frost deepened, it became clear that winter, in all its severity, was not just a test of survival, it was a test of spirit. And in the face of this challenge, medieval communities held fast, drawing on the strength of each other, the warmth of their faith, and the unyielding hope that they would make it through to another year. As the harsh winter deepened, the very essence of medieval life was tested in the most challenging ways. The cold, the isolation, the scarcity of resources. It was all part of a relentless cycle that people had to navigate year after year. However, it was not just the external forces that made winter such a profound test of endurance. It was the way these challenges affected the very core of human existence, community hope and survival. Through the darkest days of the season, people had to dig deep into their resilience, drawing strength from faith, family, and the support of the social fabric that held their villages together. For medieval people, winter was not just a season, it was a way of life. It defined how they planned their agricultural work, how they interacted with one another, and how they viewed the world. Each year they had to face the brutal reality that survival was never a guarantee. Even with all the preparations made in the preceding seasons, harvesting crops, storing food, gathering firewood, and reinforcing homes, there was always the chance that something could go wrong. The weather could turn even harsher, food could spoil, or illness could spread. And if that happened, entire communities could be thrown into chaos. The frailty of life during the winter months became a harsh reminder of how much people relied on each other. In the absence of modern technologies that allow us to control our environments, medieval communities were bound together by mutual dependence. It was not just about surviving the cold, it was about sharing in the responsibility of ensuring that no one was left behind. And while the days grew shorter and the nights colder, it was in the warmth of shared community efforts that many medieval people found the strength to carry on. Medieval winters were a time of heightened vulnerability, but they were also a time of deep connection to the land and to one another. The cycle of survival during the winter was dictated by a deep awareness of the natural world. People lived in constant anticipation of what the next season would bring, and the long dark nights allowed them time to reflect on the successes and failures of the previous year. There were no distractions in the medieval winter months. The focus was solely on survival. The pace of life slowed to match the changing seasons. It was a time when the rhythm of the year marked by planting, growing, harvesting, and surviving was put on pause. The stillness of the world outside mirrored the stillness within. In the quiet of winter, people often found solace in their faith. The church, which had played a crucial role throughout the year, now became an even more central figure in medieval life. Religion offered comfort, hope, and a sense of control in a world that seemed entirely beyond their reach. The long winter nights provided an opportunity for spiritual reflection and connection. Church services, though simple and humble, became the central point of life during these months. People came together to pray for deliverance from the cold, for the health of their families, and for a successful new season when the warmth of spring would arrive. The church was not just a place of worship, it was a hub for social interaction, for sharing resources, and for reinforcing the bonds of the community. However, not everyone had access to the same resources. The winter months exposed the inequalities that existed within medieval society. While some families could afford to huddle together in larger, warmer homes with sufficient food stores, others were not so fortunate. The poorest members of society, who often lived in small, poorly insulated homes, were the most vulnerable to the winter's cold. For them, survival was an even greater struggle. They had to rely on charity from their wealthier neighbors or from the church to make it through the cold months. And for many, the grim reality was that charity was not always forthcoming, and even a small misstep such as a late harvest or an illness could lead to hunger, suffering, and even death. But while winter revealed the fragility of life, it also highlighted the incredible strength and resilience of medieval people. The will to survive, to endure despite all odds, became a defining feature of their existence. Through each winter, people were reminded of their shared humanity and their reliance on one another. It was in these darkest of times that the true character of a community was revealed. The communal bonds that held medieval society together were rooted in survival. The harsh winter months served as a reminder that every individual in the community had a role to play. It was during these months that the depth of mutual interdependence became most apparent. No one could make it through the winter alone. The work that had been done in the warmer months, the planting, the harvesting, the building, and the gathering, was now being tested by the cold. The community's survival depended on the collective efforts of everyone. Those who had worked harder to prepare had a responsibility to share their resources, while those who had less were expected to contribute in whatever way they could. This shared responsibility extended beyond food and firewood. During the winter, everyone's safety depended on everyone else. People worked together to keep the roads cleared, to monitor the safety of each other's homes, and to care for sick or elderly neighbors. Villagers helped each other repair roofs, reinforce doors, and ensure that the homes of the elderly were properly insulated. For the young, winter was a time to learn from their elders. The community's survival depended not only on physical labor, but also on the transmission of knowledge, from how to prepare food for storage to how to make the most of limited resources. In some cases, the collective efforts of the community went even further, creating a deeper sense of solidarity. In areas where conditions were particularly harsh, medieval people would come together for larger communal efforts. Villages would organize group hunts to ensure that there was enough meat to last the winter. In some regions, communities would pool their resources to buy firewood or send out groups to collect additional food from nearby forests. People who had access to surplus resources would share their wealth, knowing that the survival of the community was at stake. These communal practices, though rooted in necessity, also reinforced the social bonds that held the village together. Even in times of hardship, there was a recognition that survival required cooperation, solidarity, and mutual support. And yet, despite the strength of these communal ties, there was always a sense of fear. The risk of hunger, disease, and even death was a reality that medieval people faced year after year. It was a season marked by uncertainty, and even the most well-prepared communities knew that they could be at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Illnesses like the plague pneumonia and the flu could sweep through entire villages, leaving devastation in their wake. The limited understanding of medicine and the lack of sanitation made it almost impossible to stop the spread of these diseases. The cold itself could be just as deadly. People who were already weak from malnutrition or exhaustion were more susceptible to the dangers of frostbite, hypothermia, and respiratory infections. The harshness of winter brought with it the constant anxiety that disaster could strike at any moment. People lived in a state of constant vigilance, aware that each day could bring a new crisis. For many, the harsh winter months were not just a physical test, they were a mental and emotional one as well. The isolation of winter, the long nights, and the uncertainty of survival created an atmosphere of anxiety that permeated every aspect of life. It was a time when people were forced to confront their mortality head-on, to reckon with the reality that no one could truly control their fate. For many, this anxiety was mitigated by the strength of their faith. Medieval people turned to religion for comfort and hope during the long winter months. They believed that through prayer and devotion, they could earn the protection of God and the saints, ensuring that they would survive until the warmth of spring arrived. The Church, with its promises of divine intervention, became a sanctuary for those who feared the worst. It offered not just spiritual solace, but also a sense of meaning in the face of the unknowable forces that controlled their lives. As winter dragged on and spring seemed impossibly far away, the mental toll of the season continued to weigh heavily. The long nights and short days left many feeling disconnected, isolated, and uncertain. And yet, it was in the shared experience of survival that people found a way forward. The bonds that held medieval communities together were not just social or economic, they were deeply rooted in shared suffering, in a collective understanding of the harshness of life. The fight for survival, even in the most difficult of times, brought people closer, fostering a sense of unity and strength that helped them endure. Winter, for all its difficulties, was also a season of preparation for renewal. As the season passed, communities knew that they would have to face new challenges in the coming spring, but the resilience they built during the harshest months of winter would carry them through. The hardships of the winter would eventually give way to the hope of a new season, a fresh start, and the possibility of a better year. Though the cycle of survival was unrelenting, it was also one of renewal. Each winter brought its lessons, and each spring brought the promise of new life. In these darkest months of winter, the strength of the community, the bonds that held people together in their most vulnerable moments, was the key to survival. And as the cold finally gave way to the warmth of spring, medieval people could rest easy knowing that they had survived another cycle ready to begin anew. As winter's cold grip finally began to loosen and the first breath of spring stirred in the frozen landscape, the medieval world, like nature itself, entered a season of transition. The long, dark months of hardship, scarcity, and isolation were slowly giving way to a new cycle of growth, but not without the remnants of winter's challenges lingering in the minds and hearts of those who had endured it. The arrival of spring was not simply a change in temperature or a burst of new life. It was a moment of profound relief, a breath drawn after an exhausting struggle. Yet for all its promise, spring was not a cure-all. The scars of winter remained, and the reality of survival would continue to weigh heavily on the medieval communities that had just endured one of the harshest seasons of the year. Spring was a season of renewal, yes, but it was also a season of reckoning. The survival of medieval communities depended not just on the arrival of warmth, but on how well they had weathered the harsh months leading up to it. What had they lost in winter? What resources had dwindled down to nothing? What injuries, illnesses, and hunger had taken their toll? These were questions that hung in the air as the snow began to melt, and the first signs of life reemerged in the fields, forests, and homes. For medieval people, spring was a fragile time, one that required both relief and preparation. They had made it through winter, now they had to ensure that they would make it through the next cycle of the seasons. As spring unfolded, the land began to thaw and the earth revealed its promise of new life. The grain fields, once buried under a blanket of snow, slowly emerged, ready to receive the first plowing of the season. The trees began to bud, and the once barren branches filled with life. The animals too stirred, emerging from their winter shelters, eager to graze on the fresh grass that would soon fill the pastures. This was the moment of renewal, a time when everything seemed possible again. The struggle of the previous months, though fresh in memory, began to fade into the distance as new growth took center stage. However, the work of survival was far from over. The arrival of spring was not the end of the struggle, it was only the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing cycle of survival. For medieval people, spring brought a new set of challenges. The thawing ground, though, welcome also brought its own set of dangers. The ground was still wet from melting snow and could quickly turn to mud, making it difficult to plow. Early spring rains, while nourishing to crops, also pose the risk of floods. The fear of another late frost loomed large, threatening to destroy tender shoots just as they began to sprout. The delicate balance between warmth, moisture, and cold was ever present, and each day brought the hope of a good season, tempered by the reality that the forces of nature could still disrupt everything. Agriculture, as it had been in the previous months, was still the lifeblood of the medieval world. The success of the coming harvest depended on how well the fields had been prepared, how quickly the crops could be planted, and how effectively the land was tended. The work was intense. Spring plowing required both skill and brute strength, as the land, still damp and heavy from winter's cold, had to be turned over and prepared for planting. Even with the best tools, the work was exhausting. Horses and oxen were used to pull plows, but the labor required by these beasts and by those who tended them was not to be underestimated. A successful plowing season required not just physical strength, but careful knowledge of the land's rhythms. Farmers had to know when the soil was ready to receive seeds, and they had to be quick about it. Spring was short, and every day counted. Once the fields were plowed, the next critical step was sowing. Medieval people relied on their experience and knowledge of the land to know when to plant. Some crops like barley, oats, and wheat required the soil to be warm enough to encourage germination, but too much warmth could cause the seeds to wither. The timing of planting was everything. Early planting could expose the crops to the danger of late frosts, while waiting too long could delay growth and shorten the growing season. The decisions made in these early months of spring determined whether the community would have enough food to survive until the next harvest, or whether they would face a year of hunger. In addition to crops, the care of livestock during spring was just as vital to survival. Many medieval communities kept animals for food labor and clothing. As the temperatures began to warm, people moved their livestock from the shelters where they had been kept during the winter months to pastures where they could graze on the fresh spring grass. This was a time when calves, lambs, and other young animals were born, and the success of these births was crucial. Livestock provided not just food but essential materials, milk, wool, and leather that helped support the community through the entire year. If the young animals thrived, the community had a strong chance of doing the same. If disease or illness struck the livestock, however, the community faced not just a loss of food, but a loss of crucial resources for trade, clothing, and warmth. But spring was not without its dangers. As the ground thawed and the earth came to life, so too did pests and vermin. Rodents, insects, and even larger animals could destroy crops, contaminating them or eating them before they had a chance to mature. Medieval people had developed methods to protect their crops from these pests, but the damage could still be devastating. The first few weeks of spring were a particularly vulnerable time for crops. New shoots were delicate and easy to destroy. Birds, insects, and rodents could wipe out an entire field before it had a chance to grow. Farmers used a variety of techniques to deter these pests, including building scarecrows, creating protective barriers, and using herbal remedies to ward off insects. Yet, despite these efforts, pests were often impossible to keep completely under control. The risk that spring would bring with it the ruin of crops hung heavy over the heads of every medieval farmer. Beyond the physical threats of pests, the early spring months also brought with them the risk of disease. As the weather warmed, communities began to emerge from the isolation of winter, and with that emergence came the increased risk of illness. People who had been living in close quarters throughout the winter months, sharing food, shelter, and warmth, were now more susceptible to diseases that could spread quickly through the community. The long winter months had weakened many people's immune systems, and now the warming weather created ideal conditions for the spread of infection. Respiratory illnesses like pneumonia and influenza became more prevalent as the temperature fluctuated. People who had survived the harshness of winter could now fall victim to the illnesses that came with the change of seasons. Spring was also a time when disease spread from animals to humans. The close proximity of livestock to human dwellings meant that diseases that affected animals, such as brucellosis, could infect people as well. Medieval people had little understanding of how diseases were transmitted, and the lack of sanitation and medical knowledge meant that disease could spread unchecked. Even a small outbreak of disease among the livestock could lead to a larger epidemic within the human population, devastating entire communities in the process. Despite the many dangers and challenges of spring, there were signs of hope. The longer days, the warmer weather, and the early growth of crops offered the promise of a better year ahead. People worn down by the hardships of winter found new energy as they watched the fields come to life. The first green shoots, the blossoming trees, and the warmth of the sun on their skin were all signs that life would continue despite the struggles that had come before. Spring was a time of renewal, a time when the promise of a good harvest could turn even the most difficult year into one of hope. As the season unfolded, medieval people found solace in the rhythms of the land. They knew that survival was never guaranteed, but they also understood that the land had a way of providing if they worked with it. The delicate balance between nature's forces and human effort was always a gamble, but spring was the season when that gamble felt most alive. The work of planting, caring for animals, and ensuring the health of crops had begun, but would take months before the results were clear. In these early days of spring, people were left with the sense of anticipation and optimism, knowing that the hard work they had put into preparing for the season would either bear fruit or fall short. As the days stretched out and the first signs of summer began to appear, medieval communities began to turn their attention to the future. They had made it through the harshness of winter, and they had made it through the uncertainty of spring. The harvest was still months away, but the work of survival was ongoing. Through it all, the medieval people understood one truth. Survival was not a one-time event. It was a constant, unyielding effort. And though the seasons would change, the effort to endure would remain the same. The medieval cycle of seasons, each one bringing with it its own set of challenges and triumphs, was a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Every season had its difficulties, its moments of doubt and fear, but each also brought the hope of new beginnings, of new growth, and of new opportunities. As the community worked through the early days of spring, the promise of a good harvest of a successful year was held in their hands. And as the sun shone down on the land, so too did the spirit of resilience continue to shine through, guiding them into the future with a renewed sense of hope and determination. As the cycle of seasons continues, we come to realize that survival, resilience, and hope are not just about enduring the hardships we face. They are about the strength we find in one another and the world around us. After all the struggles, the long nights, the cold winters, and the uncertainty of each year, it is the will to carry on that defines us. The work, the shared labor, the quiet moments of community. These are the threads that bind us through the hardest times. Now that the seasons have turned, we find ourselves in a place of renewal, where the seeds we've sown, the effort we've made, and the resilience we've nurtured are all beginning to bloom. It's not just about what we've endured, but how we've transformed those challenges into strength, into growth, into new beginnings. And as the earth once again awakens from its long slumber, we are reminded that no matter how dark the night or how harsh the winter, there is always the promise of spring, a chance to rise again. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. Let the rhythm of the seasons soothe your mind as we ease into tonight's journey together. Tomorrow is another day, and just like the medieval communities we've journeyed through, you too have the strength to face whatever the future holds.